An experiment with a spinning disk seemed to mess with gravity itself. Objects placed above it got lighter. Scientists tried to weaponize plasma, firing superheated matter at thousands of miles per second, and one Canadian government project set out to figure out if UFOs were flying with magnetic fields instead of engines. These are government experiments that broke the laws of physics. In the mid-90s, a Russian scientist named Eugene Podlaknov claimed he'd found a way to partially block gravity. His setup involved a spinning disk made from a superconducting material, a kind of super cold ceramic that lets electricity flow without resistance. When this disk spun at high speed, inside a magnetic field, Podlaknov said objects placed above it weighed up to 2% less. That might not sound like much, but if this was true, it meant he'd found a way to reduce gravity itself, which completely goes against what Isaac Newton and Einstein told us. The claim made enough noise that NASA actually took it seriously. They tried to replicate the experiment, never got the exact same results. But if he was right, it would mean we could manipulate gravity, which opens the door to things like gravity shields or new ways to power spacecraft. In the early 2000s, the US Air Force started working on something called the Marauder Project. This was a secret program focused on creating a plasma railgun, a weapon that fires plasma projectiles at insanely high speeds, up to about 3% the speed of light. For context, light travels at roughly 186,000 miles per second, so 3% of that is still over 5,500 miles per second. That's not just fast, it's practically mind-blowing. Plasma is a super hot, charged gas, and controlling it in a weapon form means you're working with physics that go beyond what we normally see in everyday life. The Marauder aimed to launch donut-shaped plasma bolts that could destroy targets with extreme precision and power. This involved pushing electrical currents and magnetic fields to their absolute limits, crossing into the territory of near light-speed physics. The exact details are classified, but Marauder showed how military research can test the edges of what physics says is possible. Back in the 50s, Canada launched something called Project Magnet, a government-funded study exploring whether magnetic fields could explain UFO flight. The idea was that if aliens were flying saucers, maybe their craft used magnetism to hover and zoom around, which would break our understanding of physics because it defies how planes and rockets work. Scientists and engineers in Project Magnet installed magnetometers, which are devices that measure magnetic fields, and they placed them at various spots across Canada to detect unusual magnetic activity that might hint at alien technology. They also investigated reports of strange blights and objects in the sky. The project was one of the first official government efforts to take UFOs and aliens seriously. Project Magnet didn't find any alien flying saucers or new physics breakthroughs, unfortunately, at least not officially, but it was ahead of its time in the idea that magnetism could be the key to future technology. Even today, research into magnetic propulsion is still a cutting-edge field. In 1989, two chemists, Martin Fleischmann and Stanley Pons, stood in front of the world and said they'd done something insane. They'd created nuclear fusion in a glass jar on a table. Now, fusion is what powers the sun. It's when atoms smash together so hard that they fuse, releasing a ton of energy. Normally, to make this happen, you need insane heat, millions of degrees, which obviously isn't something you pull off in a lab without a nuclear reactor. But these two guys claimed they found a shortcut. They said they'd gotten fusion to happen using a piece of metal called palladium, soaked in heavy water. That's water where the hydrogen atoms are heavier than normal. The way they told it, the palladium somehow packed the hydrogen atoms so tightly together they fused without the heat, without the radiation, without the giant facility. Scientists lost their minds. This was going to change the world. No more gas, no more oil, just endless cheap power from a bucket of water. When other scientists tried to copy the experiment, most of them couldn't get it to work. People started calling it junk science, but cold fusion never fully went away. Even now, private labs and startups are still trying to crack it. Starting in the early 90s, the US military and scientific agencies began operating HAARP's High Frequency Active Auroral Research Program in Alaska. HAARP is basically a giant radio transmitter that blasts huge amounts of energy into the ionosphere, which is the layer of Earth's atmosphere filled with charged particles way above us. The official goal was to see how this layer reacts when hit with strong radio waves, which helps improve things like communication and GPS. Basically, HAARP throws a rock into a pond. Those radio waves create little ripples in the ionosphere, which acts like Earth's invisible magnetic shield. Scientists watch how these ripples move and change to understand how the shield protects us from space weather. But sending that much energy into the sky doesn't go unnoticed, and folks quickly spun conspiracy theories claiming that HAARP could control weather, cause earthquakes, or even mess with people's minds. None of those stories have ever been proven, but the science behind HAARP is legit, and it's pretty cool. The project, officially shut down in 2014, was handed over to the University of Alaska, which still uses it for research. In 2015, scientists at the Laser Interferometer Gravitational Wave Observatory, or LIGO, basically did the impossible. They caught a ripple in space itself. Two black holes had smashed into each other over 1 billion years ago, and that crash sent out gravitational waves, like shock waves, through the universe. We'd heard this was possible. Einstein said it was back in 1915, but no one had actually ever seen it happen. The Laser Interferometer Gravitational Wave Observatory is made up of two giant tunnels, each over 2.5 miles long, filled with lasers built to measure movements smaller than a single atom. What LIGO, or LIGO, detected was so small, it's insane. It would be like noticing your car move 1/1,000,000th of a hair's width, but that tiny wobble proved something massive. That space-time isn't fixed. It stretches, it vibrates, moves.
In the early 1900s, a horse named Clever Hans became famous because he seemed to be able to do math, tell time, and answer questions by tapping his hoof. His owner would ask him a problem, and Hans would tap out the correct answer, shocking crowds and even confusing investigators. At first, nobody could find obvious fraud. But when psychologist Oscar Funkst studied Hans more carefully, he discovered something even stranger than a trick. Hans only got the answers right when the person asking the question already knew the answer and the horse could see them. The horse was not doing math, he was reading tiny unconscious body movements from humans. Cues so subtle that even the people giving them had no idea they were doing it. The experiment became famous because it showed that researchers can accidentally influence results without realizing it. Clever Hans did not prove a horse could calculate, he proved humans could unknowingly feed answers into an experiment. In 2002, researchers tested whether a common knee surgery for osteoarthritis was actually helping patients as much as people believed. Some patients received the real surgery, while others received a sham procedure where doctors made small cuts and acted like surgery had happened, but did not actually repair anything inside the knee. The result was shocking. The patients who received the fake surgery improved about as much as the patients who received the real procedure. That did not mean all surgery is useless, but it did show something very disturbing about pain, belief, and the body. These patients had gone through the experience of surgery, expected healing, and then felt real improvement even when the main procedure had not been done. The experiment forced doctors to question whether some treatments work because of the actual physical repair or because the brain and body respond powerfully to the belief that something has been fixed. In the 1950s, psychologist Harry Harlow ran a disturbing experiment with baby rhesus monkeys to test what creates attachment. At the time, some experts believed babies bonded with mothers mainly because mothers provided food. So Harlow gave infant monkeys two fake mothers, one made of wire that provided milk and one covered in soft cloth that gave comfort. If love was mostly about food, the monkeys should have stayed with the wire mother, but they did not. They clung to the cloth mother for comfort and only went to the wire one briefly to eat. The result changed psychology because it showed that touch, safety, and emotional comfort were not luxuries. They were essential. But the experiment also had a dark side because Harlow proved the importance of love by depriving young animals of it. The result was scientifically important but deeply unsettling. In the 1960s and 70s, researcher John B. Calhoun created what should have been a perfect world for mice. The enclosure had plenty of food, water, nesting material, and no predators. But then, the society inside the enclosure began to fall apart. Some mice became violent, some stopped mating, some mothers abandoned their babies, others withdrew completely and spent their time grooming instead of interacting. Eventually, even though food and water were still available, the population stopped reproducing and collapsed. The experiment became famous because the mice were not destroyed by starvation, disease, or an outside threat. They were living in a controlled world where their basic needs were met, but their social behavior still broke down. Scientists are careful not to apply mouse behavior directly to humans, but the results remain disturbing because it suggested that overcrowding and social stress could destroy a population from within. In the 20th century, doctors treated some severe epilepsy patients by cutting the corpus callosum, the bundle of nerves connecting the left and right sides of the brain. The surgery was meant to stop seizures from spreading, but when scientists studied these patients afterward, the results were bizarre. In some tests, a patient could say they did not see an object, while one hand could still point to it. Information shown to one side of the brain could be understood by that side, but not explained by the speaking side. It was as if the two halves of the brain could know two different things at the same time. The experiment did not prove there were literally two separate people in one body, but it did challenge the idea that consciousness is one simple, unified thing. It suggested the self may be less like a single voice in control and more like different brain systems working together behind the scenes.
Next up, I'm going to talk a bit about muons, which are subatomic particles similar to electrons, but over 200 times heavier, and they can pass through solid objects like rock or steel with ease. Scientists at Fermilab near Chicago have this massive 50-foot wide magnet ring. They've been flinging muons through it to watch how they behave. Now that sounds weird, but it's important, because if the movement of the muons doesn't match what our physics books say it should, well, something's off. And turns out it is. The way they move seems to show there might be an invisible force or unknown particle interfering with them, something we haven't accounted for in the standard model of physics, which is basically our best blueprint for how the universe works at the smallest level. In 2021 and again in 2023, researchers got results that strongly hinted something strange really is going on. They're still trying to confirm it, but if the anomaly holds up, it could mean one of two things. Either there's a flaw in our current model of physics, or there's something out there we haven't discovered yet. Either way, it'd be one of the biggest shakeups in science for decades. In 1963, the US military dumped 480 million copper needles into Earth's orbit. They wanted to build a backup communication system in case the Soviets ever knocked out global radio during the Cold War. So these tiny needles, each one about 1.8 centimeters long, were meant to act like little antennas floating in space. So if radio signals couldn't bounce off the ionosphere or satellites were down, they'd bounce off this artificial belt instead. The idea came from Lincoln Labs at MIT. It was launched under a program called Project Needles, later renamed Project West Ford. They figured that by placing these needles into a circular orbit above Earth, they could make a crude but reliable way to keep communication alive in a worst-case scenario. Well, when the needles were deployed, they didn't exactly form the tidy rings scientists were hoping for. Most of them clumped together, and radio signal testing was underwhelming. The project was eventually shelved, but not before astronomers lost their minds over it. A lot of them saw it as just littering space with metal debris, and it set off this wave of protest from scientists around the world. Even though it didn't work out, West Ford did show how far governments were willing to go during the Cold War, to the point of turning Earth into a giant radio antenna. The US government has been pouring money into quantum teleportation since the early 2000s. Now, what is quantum teleportation though? Well, this involves transferring information from one place to another instantly, without anything physically moving in between. It works by using something called quantum entanglement. That's when two tiny particles become linked, but not physically linked. See, the funny thing is, once this link happens, if you change one particle, the other reacts instantly, no matter how far apart they actually are. Einstein called this spooky action at a distance. In 2004, the Defense Advanced Research Projects Agency, or DARPA, which is the Pentagon's research arm, they helped set up a working quantum teleportation network in Boston. It connected Harvard, Boston University, and a tech firm called BBN. Basically, they used this entanglement trick to send ultra-secure messages. If anyone tried to intercept the message, the entanglement would break, and the system would know right away. That's also what makes this so crazy. It's not just fast, it's almost unhackable. You can't read the message without leaving fingerprints. The experiment proved that it could work in real-world conditions, not just labs. The technology is still in its early stages, but if this scales up, it could totally change how we communicate across large distances. Scientists found some very odd results in a test that could completely change our model of physics. So in 2022, scientists at Fermilab, a massive government-funded particle lab near Chicago, announced they'd been studying this tiny thing called the W boson. Their measurements said it was heavier than it was supposed to be. But first of all, what is a W boson? Well, it's a tiny particle that helps certain types of nuclear decay happen. It basically carries one of the fundamental forces of nature, the weak nuclear force, which is what makes radioactive stuff break down. According to our best theory of how the universe works, called the Stanford model, we can predict the W boson's mass almost exactly. But when the Fermilab team measured it, they found it was heavier than the theory said it should be. Not just by a little, by quite a large margin. If their result is correct, it means there's something wrong with the current model of physics. Something is either missing or we're just not getting something. And then in 2023 and 2024, scientists at the Large Hadron Collider in Europe tried to measure the same thing. Their results were totally normal though. So now you've got two of the world's biggest physics labs arguing over whether one of the building blocks of reality is wrong. They technically weren't arguing, but they were surprised by the results. Either Fermilab's equipment was off, or we just found the crack that could lead to a brand new kind of physics.
In 1953, scientist Stanley Miller tried to recreate the possible conditions of early Earth inside a sealed glass system. He added water, gases, heat, and electrical sparks meant to imitate lightning. The goal was not to create life, but to see whether simple chemistry could produce anything important. After a few days, the liquid inside the experiment changed color, and when Miller tested it, he found amino acids, which are the key building blocks of life. Nothing living had been placed inside the system. There were no cells, no DNA, and no organisms, just basic chemicals and electricity. Miller did not create life, but he showed that some of life's ingredients could form from non-living matter. Decades later, old samples from the experiment were retested with better tools, and scientists found even more organic compounds than Miller originally knew were there. The experiment did not solve how life began, but it made the question much stranger. How close can chemistry get to life before something actually becomes alive? In 1976, NASA's Viking landers carried experiments to Mars designed to search for signs of life. One test took Martian soil, added nutrients, and watched to see if gas would be released. On Earth, that kind of reaction can happen when microbes are feeding. And when Viking ran the experiment, the Martian soil reacted in a way that looked surprisingly biological. Even stranger, when some soil was heated first, the reaction weakened or disappeared, which is what might happen if living organisms were destroyed by heat. But another Viking instrument failed to find clear organic molecules in the soil, creating a huge contradiction. How could one test look like possible life, while another failed to find the chemistry life should leave behind? NASA ultimately concluded it had not proven life on Mars, and many scientists believe unusual soil chemistry caused the reaction. But the result is still debated, because a robot on Mars ran a life detection experiment, got a result that looked a little too alive, and left scientists arguing for decades. In 1989, chemists Martin Fleischmann and Stanley Pons claimed they had achieved nuclear fusion at room temperature using a small tabletop experiment. That sounded impossible because fusion is the process that powers the sun and normally requires extreme heat and pressure. If their result was real, it could mean cheap, clean, nearly unlimited energy. That announcement caused a frenzy, and labs around the world rushed to repeat the experiment, but most could not reproduce the result reliably. Some saw strange heat effects, while others found nothing at all. The expected nuclear byproducts were also missing or unclear. Scientists eventually concluded the original result was likely caused by errors, flawed measurements, or misunderstood chemistry. But the reason this experiment became so infamous is that, for a brief moment, it looked like someone had put the power of the sun inside a beaker. Then, when the world tried to test it, the miracle result seemed to disappear. In the late 1960s, scientist Raymond Davis Jr. built a massive underground experiment to detect neutrinos coming from the sun. Neutrinos are tiny particles produced by nuclear reactions inside stars, and they are so hard to catch that Davis had to bury his detector deep inside a gold mine. The experiment worked, but the results made no sense. Davis found solar neutrinos, but only about 1/3 of the number scientists expected. At first, researchers thought something must be wrong with the detector, the math, or even the model of how the sun worked, but the missing neutrinos kept staying missing. For decades, this was one of physics' biggest mysteries. The eventual answer was bizarre. Neutrinos can change type as they travel through space, turning into versions the detector could not easily see. So the particles had not vanished, they had transformed. Before that was understood, the experiment left scientists wondering whether the detector was wrong, whether the sun was wrong, or matter itself was changing on the way to Earth. In 2011, psychologist Daryl Bem published a study that seemed to suggest people could be influenced by events that had not happened yet. In one experiment, participants appeared to perform slightly better on memory tests before they practiced the words later. In another, people seemed to guess the location of certain images at a rate just above chance before the computer randomly placed them. The effects were small, but the results were statistically significant, which made the study impossible to ignore. If true, it would challenge basic ideas about time and cause and effect, but when other scientists tried to repeat the findings, they could not reliably reproduce them. Instead of proving that people could sense the future, the experiment became famous for exposing problems in psychology research, especially around statistics and replication. The scariest part was not that humans might predict the future, it was that a serious experiment could make reality look broken, even when the real problem may have been hidden in the scientific process itself. From the 1940s to 1989, a top-secret British facility called Porton Down conducted chemical weapons testing on its own soldiers. This is not ancient history. This ran until the year Taylor Swift was born, which is honestly a very weird way to measure history. Thousands of servicemen were told that they were participating in research to find a cure for the common cold. Instead, they were exposed to sarin, VX, and other nerve agents. In 1953, a 20-year-old Royal Air Force engineer named Ronald Madison died during a sarin exposure test. He was one of the youngest casualties of the program. The Ministry of Defense covered it up for decades. An inquest in 2004 finally ruled his death unlawful. Porton Down still exists, but live human testing of chemical agents stopped. Publicly, at least. Which is the kind of sentence I hate having to end with, but here we are. Between 1945 and 1947, researchers working on the Manhattan Project injected small amounts of plutonium directly into the bodies of 18 American hospital patients. They did not tell the patients what they were doing. They did not ask for permission. The patients were in hospitals for other reasons: broken bones, routine treatments, and the scientists simply added the plutonium to their IVs. They wanted to see how plutonium moved through the human body. They tracked it in excrement, in tissue samples, in autopsies. When investigative journalist Eileen Wellsome uncovered the experiment in the 1990s, it triggered a national scandal. The government settled a class action lawsuit, and President Clinton issued a formal apology in 1995. The research was permanently shut down, but the data collected from those 18 people, data gathered without a single signature on a consent form, was still being cited in radiation safety guidelines for decades. After After World War II, scientists at Los Alamos kept a 6.2 kilogram sphere of plutonium. It was originally meant for a third nuclear bomb, but the war ended before it was used. So they started running what were called criticality experiments, basically pushing the plutonium right to the edge of a nuclear chain reaction, then backing off at the last moment. In August 1945, physicist Harry Daghlian was working alone at night. He dropped a tungsten carbide brick onto the core. There was a blue flash, he absorbed a massive radiation dose, and died 25 days later. Less than a year after that, in May 1946, physicist Louis Slotin was demonstrating the exact same type of experiment to colleagues. He was using a screwdriver to keep two halves of a beryllium reflector apart. The screwdriver slipped, the reflector closed, blue flash, Slotin felt heat in his hands and tasted acid in his mouth. He was dead 9 days later. 7 other people in the room survived, but several developed radiation-related cancers years later. 2 deaths from the exact same plutonium sphere in under a year. After Slotin, Los Alamos permanently banned all hands-on criticality experiments. No one has done one since. I don't know, maybe, just maybe, holding a nuclear reaction open with a screwdriver was not the best move ever.
Of course, MK Ultra. This was a top secret project carried out by the CIA during the 50s and 60s. It was pretty much the continuation of Project Artichoke. Its goal was to explore techniques for mind control and interrogation. MK Ultra used a wide range of experiments, including the use of illicit substances, hypnosis, sensory deprivation, and psychological torment. The ultimate goal was to develop methods of influencing and then manipulating human behavior and extracting information through the use of psychology. The experiments were obviously highly unethical here, violating basic human rights. Participants included unwitting civilians, military personnel, and prisoners who were all subjected to extreme psychological and physical harm without their informed consent. They were administered mind-altering substances leading to unpredictable and often traumatic experiences for the subjects involved. There was very little oversight or accountability here. Many documents related to the project were destroyed or classified as well, and the true extent of MK Ultra only came to light through investigations in the 70s.
And finally, we have the Stanford Prison Experiment. In 1971, an experiment was conducted in order to better understand the psychological implications of power dynamics. University students were recruited to play either guards or prisoners. The assignments were random, 12 prisoners, 12 guards, and then, without warning, those assigned prisoners were arrested, fingerprinted, blindfolded, and driven to a makeshift prison. There, they were stripped naked and instructed to change into prison uniforms. Subjects assigned the role of guards arrived at the prison and were given military-style uniforms, dark glasses, whistles, and clubs, and they were instructed to do whatever they believed was necessary in order to control those playing the role of inmates. On day 1, confrontational behavior had already begun. Guards raided prison cells and woke inmates up in the middle of the night for attendance checks. By night 2, the inmates had had enough, and so they barricaded themselves inside their cells. When the guards found out, they were not happy. They sprayed the inmates down with fire extinguishers, stripped them of their clothes, and took their beds. After that, the inmates became pretty submissive, but the guards only got more aggressive. The experiment was supposed to last for 2 weeks, but after just 5 days it ended due to the extreme behaviors that were taking place. Both the prisoners and the guards, surprisingly, suffered lasting trauma from the ordeal, experiencing flashbacks, severe anxiety, and some people even developed PTSD.
Back in 1966, a psychiatrist named Charles K. Hoffling ran a test inside a real hospital without telling the nurses. Here's what he did. Nurses working the night shift got a phone call from a man saying he was a doctor. They didn't know him, and he wasn't even in the building. He told them to give a patient something called Astrotin. Little did the nurses know this was a fictional medication. The fake bottle had been placed in a drawer, clearly labeled with a 10 milligram maximum daily dose. The dose the man on the phone gave them was double the safe limit. And on top of that, the hospital rules said you're not even supposed to take orders like that over the phone. Well, out of 22 nurses, 21 were about to give the dose. Some of them had picked up the medication and started heading toward the patient before the researchers stepped in to stop them. Afterward, when they talked to the nurses, a lot of them admitted They had their doubts. It didn't feel right, but they went along with it because the instruction came from someone they thought was a doctor. That's what made this so unsettling. These were trained professionals, people that you trust to make your safety a top priority, not go ahead with something their gut is telling them is wrong just because an authority figure told them to do so. In 1973, psychologist David Rosnan wanted to see how easy it was to get labeled as mentally ill. So he and 7 other completely healthy people checked themselves into psychiatric hospitals across the US. They all said the same thing when they showed up. They were hearing voices. Every single one of them was admitted. As soon as they were inside, though, they stopped acting. No more fake symptoms. They told staff they felt fine and were acting totally normal. But instead of being released, they were diagnosed with serious conditions like schizophrenia, and they were kept there. The shortest stay was about a week. One of them didn't get out for nearly 2 months. While they were inside, they wrote down everything that they saw. Even that got twisted. One doctor noted that writing in a notebook was a sign of mental illness, calling it compulsive behavior. Eventually, they were let go, but only after agreeing that they had a disorder that was now in remission, not that they were never sick. Probably one of the strangest experiments that I've ever read about. Imagine you're using a straw to fire tiny paper spitballs at a wall with 2 vertical slits in it. Naturally, you'd expect the wads to pass through the slits and end up forming these 2 lines on the wall behind them. In the world of tiny particles like electrons, this is exactly what happens. Until you stop looking at them, that is. When scientists fire electrons at these 2 slits without any measuring device watching, the electrons don't form 2 lines. Instead, they create this wave-like interference pattern, almost like ripples in a pond overlapping. So the electrons somehow travel through both slits at the same time. When researchers tried to outsmart the particles, essentially by placing a detector by the slits to see which one the electron actually went through, things got even weirder. As soon as that detector was turned on, the electrons stopped acting like waves and went back to acting the way you'd expect, forming 2 simple lines. It was as if the particles knew they were being watched and changed their behavior to accommodate the observer. This seems to imply that the very act of looking at the world changes how physical reality functions, at least at the particle level. In the 60s, a Tanzanian student named Erasto Mpemba noticed something that seemed to break the laws of physics during a school cooking class. He was making ice cream and realized that his hot mixture actually froze faster than the mixtures his classmates had already cooled down. When he told his teacher about this, he was laughed at, but he eventually convinced a physics professor to run an experiment. The results were not what anyone was expecting. Under certain conditions, hot water freezes faster than cold water. This makes 0 sense on the surface. If you have a cup of water at 80 degrees, say, and a cup at 20 degrees, the hot cup has to pass through that 20-degree mark on its way to freezing, so logically, the cold cup should always have a head start. Scientists have spent decades trying to pin down a single reason for this, but none of their explanations fully work every time. Neutrinos are often called ghost particles because they're nearly weightless and can pass through solid lead like it's thin air. Because they're so hard to catch, scientists built massive experiments using a rare metal called gallium to detect them. 2 major projects, one in Russia and one in Italy, used huge tanks of this metal to count how many neutrinos were coming from the sun or radioactive sources. The math for these experiments was supposed to be rock solid. Based on everything we know about nuclear physics, researchers knew exactly how many neutrinos should be hitting that gallium, but every time they ran the test, they came up short. About 20 to 30% of the expected neutrinos just weren't there. This became known as the gallium anomaly. Scientists still can't say for sure why this happens. One of the leading theories is that some neutrinos are shape-shifting into a 4th type of particle called a sterile neutrino, which is so ghostly that our detectors can't see it at all. But if this is true, it's a whole other can of worms. It would mean there's a whole category of matter that we've been completely missing, and our standard model of the universe is also missing a huge piece of the puzzle. Deep under the ground in southern China, 2,300 feet down to be exact, scientists are getting ready to launch one of the most ambitious physics experiments ever built. A 12-story tall water tank surrounding a giant glowing sphere covered in 43,000 super-sensitive light detectors. This thing is called Juno, short for Jiangmen Underground Neutrino Observatory, and it's built to hunt one of the weirdest particles in the universe, the neutrino. Neutrinos are created by nuclear reactions inside the sun, inside nuclear power plants, even inside the Earth itself. They're everywhere. Trillions of them fly through you every second without you even noticing. What makes neutrinos so strange is they can switch between different types while traveling through space. Scientists still don't know how or why that happens, but figuring it out could unlock secrets about how the universe was built and why matter exists in the first place. Juno might detect neutrinos from inside the Earth and use them to study what's going on under the crust, which could completely change how we understand earthquakes and plate tectonics. There's even talk about using neutrinos to send messages straight through the planet. China's pushing hard to be the first. At the Baksan Neutrino Observatory in the Caucasus Mountains of Russia, more than a mile underground, scientists have been messing around with a strange mystery of physics, the gallium anomaly. Again, this has to do with neutrinos. They're already strange, but this experiment might be leading to something even stranger, the possible existence of a whole new type of particle called a sterile neutrino. The experiment, called BEST, which stands for Baksan Experiment on Sterile Transitions, used 47 tons of liquid gallium, a silvery metal that melts in your hand, and they blasted it with neutrinos produced by radioactive chromium. The goal was to see how many times the neutrinos would hit the gallium and turn it into a different element, called germanium-71. But when scientists went to count how much germanium-71 was made, the numbers didn't add up. It was about 20 to 24% lower than they'd expected, even though their measurements and predictions were very precise. This is not the first time this has happened. Older experiments saw the same types of results, which is why we have what's referred to as the gallium anomaly. One possible explanation is that some of the neutrinos are vanishing, they're changing into a form that can't be detected, a sterile neutrino. Unlike normal neutrinos, these hypothetical particles wouldn't interact with anything except gravity. That's why some researchers think we might be seeing the effects of new physics that break the current model of how the universe supposedly works. Still, no one's entirely sure what's going on. Either there's a flaw in the experiment that no one's caught yet, or this could be one of the biggest clues that something is missing from the laws of physics as we know them. At Brookhaven National Lab in New York, scientists may have just rewritten part of quantum physics. Using their giant particle smasher, the relativistic heavy ion collider, they came across a new type of quantum entanglement. So if you've never heard of quantum entanglement before, it's a phenomenon where two particles become so connected that changing one will instantly affect the other, no matter how far apart they are. This is very real, and it's been proven over and over again in labs, but normally entanglement only happens between particles that are exactly the same, like two identical photons or electrons, but the Brookhaven team found something totally new. Two completely different particles were entangled. This experiment took place at the relativistic heavy ion collider, where scientists slam gold ions together at nearly the speed of light, but in this case the gold ions didn't even collide, they just passed close by each other. Each ion has a cloud of photons around it, basically particles of light. When the photon cloud from one ion passed the other, it acted like a flash bulb, setting off a super short X-ray type scan of the other ion's nucleus. What's weird is that this scan shouldn't even be possible under regular physics, because there was no physical contact between the ions. Well, the result was that two new particles popped out of nowhere, called pions, one positive and one negative, and they were entangled, somehow linked. According to Zhangbu Zhu, one of the researchers, we measure two outgoing particles and clearly their charges are different. They are different particles, but we see interference patterns that indicate these particles are entangled. End quote. So, in short, this is the first time anyone's seen two different particles become entangled like this, and it could make scientists rethink how entanglement works altogether. Back in the 70s, a Russian physicist named Nikolai Kozyrev started talking about time in a very weird way. He theorized that it was something you could tap into, almost like energy. He believed time had physical properties, that it could be detected directly, which sounds pretty insane, but Kozyrev was a respected astrophysicist, and he did experiments using spinning gyroscopes, pendulums, and these mirrored chambers now known as Kozyrev mirrors. These were large spiraled aluminum tubes that people would sit inside, and some of them said they had these out-of-body experiences and visions. The KGB supposedly took interest in his work too. The story goes they backed secret studies using these mirrors for everything from psychic research to remote viewing. Some Soviet cosmonauts were even said to have used Kozyrev mirrors in orbit to gather non-local information, which is a fancy way of saying they were trying to see or sense stuff from far away. Pretty bizarre.
In 1953, the U.S. Atomic Energy Commission launched a study to measure how much radioactive strontium-90 from nuclear testing was making its way into the human food supply. The problem was that strontium-90 accumulates in bone tissue, particularly in growing bones. So researchers needed bone samples from growing people. Over the next several years, scientists collected more than 1,500 bone samples from young people who had passed in hospitals across the United States, Canada, Europe, Australia, and South America. The bones were analyzed for strontium-90 without the knowledge or consent of the parents. The parents were told the remains were being handled for routine purposes. They were not told the bones were being shipped to laboratories for nuclear fallout research. The project was eventually exposed in the 1990s, and the government apologized. The data was real, the science was real, the way they got the samples was something nobody should have ever signed off on. In the 1950s and 60s, the CIA operated a program out of Istanbul, Turkey, where they tested experimental interrogation techniques on foreign nationals who had no idea they were being used as test subjects. The program was part of the broader MK-Ultra umbrella, but this specific operation targeted people at overseas locations where US legal protections didn't apply and oversight was essentially non-existent. Subjects were given illicit substances, including LSD and other experimental compounds, without their knowledge, and then interrogated to test whether chemical substances could force compliance, extract information, or erase memory. The full scope of what happened in Istanbul remains classified. What is known comes from partially declassified documents and the testimony of a handful of operatives. From 1955 to 1975, the U.S. Army Chemical Corps conducted classified human subject research at the Edgewood Arsenal facility in Maryland. Over 20 years, roughly 7,000 soldiers were used as test subjects. They were told they were participating in routine equipment testing, but what actually happened was that they were exposed to LSD, BZ, which is a powerful deliriant that causes hallucinations lasting up to 3 days, sarin nerve gas, VX, and other chemical agents. Many were not told what they had been given until after the experiments were over. Some were never told at all. Soldiers reported severe psychological effects lasting years. The program was finally shut down in 1975 after an Army Inspector General's report concluded that informed consent procedures had been inadequate. The full records were classified for decades. When they were partially declassified, many veterans who had been tested on didn't even know what had happened to them until they read about it in a newspaper. From 1962 to 1973, the U.S. Department of Defense conducted a series of classified tests known as Project SHAD, Shipboard Hazard and Defense. The purpose was to determine how vulnerable U.S. Navy warships were to chemical and biological weapons attacks. Over the course of the program, more than 5,000 military personnel, mostly Navy and Marine Corps, were exposed to live chemical and biological warfare agents, including sarin nerve gas, VX, and the bacteria that causes Q fever. The soldiers were not told what they were being exposed to. They were told these were routine operational tests. Some were standing on deck when aerosolized agents were sprayed over their ships. Others were inside sealed compartments when the agents were pumped through ventilation systems. The government denied the program's existence for 3 decades. When Project SHAD was finally declassified in the early 2000s, many of the veterans who had been tested on didn't learn what had happened to them until they read about it in a newspaper. Yes, this is just like the last one. Clearly, people don't learn. During the Second Sino-Japanese War and World War II, the Japanese Imperial Army operated a secret biological and chemical warfare research unit called Unit 731. Under the command of General Shiro Ishii, Unit 731 conducted experiments on prisoners of war and civilians that are among the most disturbing in all recorded history. They exposed victims to frostbite to study the effects of extreme cold on human tissue, freezing limbs solid, then testing different methods of thawing, including open flame, hot water, and cold water immersion to determine which method preserved the most tissue. Many victims lost limbs, many died. The unit also conducted vivisections, forced infections, and weapons testing on living human beings. After the war, the United States granted Ishii and his researchers immunity from prosecution in exchange for their research data. The full extent of what was done was buried for decades. Ishii never faced trial. He died of natural causes in 1959, and I don't know, I genuinely don't have any kind of joke or anything for this one. Before there was MK Ultra, there was Artichoke. Approved in 1951, Project Artichoke was the CIA's first formal program for experimenting with interrogation techniques, and it was more aggressive than anything that came after. The project's mandate was to determine whether a combination of drugs, hypnosis, and psychological coercion could be used to force subjects to reveal information against their will and then forget they had revealed it. The CIA tested a multitude of mind-altering illicit substances and experimental combinations on both willing and unwilling subjects. They explored whether hypnosis could be used to make someone commit an act they would normally find morally repulsive. The project specifically targeted prisoners, foreign nationals, and suspected double agents. Records indicate that at least one subject lost their lives during an Artichoke interrogation. The full scope remains classified. Artichoke was absorbed into MK Ultra in 1953, but the techniques developed under Artichoke became the foundation for everything that followed. Between 1946 and 1948, US researchers led by Dr. John Cutler deliberately infected approximately 1,300 Guatemalan prisoners, psychiatric patients, and soldiers with syphilis and other sexually transmitted diseases. They wanted to study the effectiveness of penicillin as a preventative treatment. The subjects were not told what was being done to them. They were not asked for consent. Some were infected through direct inoculation, others were infected by being provided with infected sex workers, and at least 83 people died as a result. When the study ended, the results were buried. They stayed buried for over 60 years. While MK Ultra was testing drugs on people, MK Naomi was stockpiling weapons to kill them. In 1949 to 1970, the CIA and the US Army Biological Warfare Laboratories operated a joint program to develop and maintain a covert stockpile of biological weapons for assassination and sabotage. The program maintained cultures of anthrax, smallpox, tuberculosis, and other lethal pathogens. They developed delivery systems including poisoned pens, contaminated handkerchiefs, and specialized spray devices designed to kill or incapacitate specific targets without leaving evidence. MK Naomi was reportedly used in at least one attempted assassination against Congolese independence leader Patrice Lumumba, though the biological weapon was apparently never successfully deployed. During apartheid, the South African Defense Force ran a program at a military hospital outside Pretoria from 1969 to 1987. Between 900 and 1,200 LGBTQ+ service members were identified, arrested, and forced to undergo treatment designed to cure their homosexuality. The treatments included electroshock therapy, hormone treatments, and in some cases, forced surgical gender reassignment operations performed without genuine consent. Patients who couldn't be cured were given medical discharges that destroyed their military careers and made them unemployable. When apartheid ended, the Truth and Reconciliation Commission heard testimony from survivors. Levin fled to Canada, was later convicted of sexually assaulting patients in his private practice, and was sent to prison, but not for what he did to hundreds of soldiers under military authority. For that, nobody was ever held accountable.
Back in 2022, a surgeon named Bruce Moseley ran an experiment. He had a group of patients with serious knee pain to the point where they could barely walk. He split them into 3 groups. 2 groups got real surgery. One had their knee joint flushed out. The other had the damaged cartilage cleaned up. The 3rd group, though, this is where it gets interesting, they got taken into the operating room, put under, and Moseley made 3 small incisions in their skin, but he never actually went inside the knee. He didn't really touch anything. It was completely fake. Oddly though, the people who had the fake surgery felt just as good as the ones who had the real thing. Same pain relief, same improvement in how they moved around, and this wasn't just them saying they felt better to be polite. They were physically moving better. 2 years later, those same people were walking and climbing stairs just as well as the patients who had actual surgical work done on their knees. So what that tells us is that the brain has this enormous, almost hard to believe ability to reduce chronic pain or even start healing just because it believes that something was done. The belief alone was enough to create a real, measurable physical change. In 1979, a guy named John Hutchinson, who was essentially just a hobbyist inventor living in Vancouver, was playing around with a bunch of high-voltage machines and radio wave equipment, stuff he'd pieced together trying to recreate some of Nikola Tesla's old experiments. And while he was running all this equipment at the same time, he started noticing things happening in his lab that made absolutely no sense. Heavy objects were lifting off the ground and floating, like a 70-pound cannonball, just slowly rising into the air. Pieces of metal were going soft at room temperature, like they'd turned into clay, even though nothing was heating them. Wood and metal were fusing together. He got some of this on camera, and the footage looked completely insane. Here's the part that's hard to just wave away. People from the Pentagon and from Los Alamos National Laboratory, a facility that works on nuclear weapons, actually came to his apartment and saw this happening. They filmed some of it themselves, but when they tried to take his equipment back to their home labs to replicate it, nothing worked, and Hutchinson himself could never get it to happen on demand. It was inconsistent and unpredictable, which led a lot of people to call the whole thing a hoax. But the original footage still exists and nobody's been able to fully explain it. If what Hutchinson captured was real, it means there's some combination of radio frequencies that can mess with gravity and change how dense matter is. The problem is that whatever specific setup made it work seems to be a mystery nobody's been able to recreate since. There's something that keeps showing up in survival stories across different parts of the world. It's consistent enough that it has its own name, the third man factor. This is when someone in a life-threatening situation starts to sense another person nearby, a presence. Ernest Shackleton, the famous explorer, is probably the most well-known example. He and 2 other men were crossing the mountains of South Georgia Island in brutal conditions, and all 3 of them, independently, felt like there was a 4th person walking with them. This mysterious 4th person didn't say anything, it just felt like this calm, steady presence was guiding them through. Hundreds of other people have reported the same thing. Climbers running out of oxygen near the summit of mountains, sailors lost out at sea, people trapped in wreckage, and in a lot of these cases, the presence isn't just a vague feeling of company, it's giving them specific information. Turn left here, stay awake, keep moving. Instructions that end up saving their lives. Scientists have tried to explain it by pointing to what happens to the brain under extreme stress and oxygen deprivation. There's even a device called the God Helmet that uses magnetic fields on the brain's temporal lobes that can make people feel like someone else is in the room with them. So there is a mechanical explanation here, but that doesn't fully explain how specific and useful these encounters have been. It doesn't explain why the presence almost always helps, why it shows up across people with completely different belief systems, or why the information it gives tends to be exactly right. It acts a lot less like a hallucination, more like some kind of backup system. The brain switches on when it's about to shut down completely. When NASA landed the Viking probes on Mars in 1976, the big question was whether anything was alive in the Martian soil. So they ran a test called the labeled release experiment. So the idea was to scoop up some Martian dirt, add a liquid full of nutrients laced with radioactive carbon, and then wait. If there were microbes in the soil eating those nutrients, they'd breathe out radioactive carbon dioxide and the sensors would catch it. The test came back positive. The sensors picked up exactly the kind of gas spike you'd expect to see if there were tiny living things in the soil. But the problem was, another instrument on the same lander, one that was designed to look for organic molecules, it found nothing. So there was a contradiction. NASA called the whole thing inconclusive. In the late 60s, a scientist named John Calhoun built the most comfortable environment he possibly could for a group of mice. He called it Universe 25. It was unlimited food, unlimited water. There were no predators, of course. He put 4 pairs of mice inside and let them do their thing, and for a while it looked exactly like you'd expect. The population exploded. Numbers were doubling every 55 days. But then, when the population hit around 2,200 mice, which was still nowhere near the physical limit of the space, everything started to fall apart. With no competition for food and no threats to deal with, the mice kind of stopped behaving like mice. The males started attacking each other randomly, or they just stopped engaging. A whole group of males, which Calhoun called the beautiful ones, they just totally checked out. They didn't mate, they didn't fight, they didn't really interact with anything. They just ate, slept, and groomed themselves all day. The females stopped nursing for their young. They stopped reproducing. Even though the food was still there, even though nothing physical was actually wrong with them, the birth rate dropped to 0. The mice were healthy, they just stopped wanting to continue. Calhoun described it as a kind of death that happens before the physical death, the loss of whatever makes a social animal want to participate in life. Eventually the last mouse died, and it was left was a fully stocked, perfectly safe enclosure with no living mouse inside it. So what the experiment seemed to show is that struggle isn't just an obstacle to a good life. For a lot of species, maybe even us, it might actually be the thing that keeps life going in the first place. I mean, take it completely away and something essential seems to go with it.
From 1951 to 1974, that's 23 years, researchers from the University of Pennsylvania used inmates at Holmesburg Prison as test subjects. They paid them a few dollars, they exposed them to chemical warfare agents, radioactive isotopes, hallucinogens, and experimental cosmetics. One researcher, Dr. Albert Kligman, famously said, and I'm quoting, "All I saw before me was acres of skin. The inmates developed rashes, burns, and long-term health problems that followed them for life." The program ran for over 2 decades before it was finally exposed and shut down in 1974. When you hear about informed consent in modern medicine, this is one of the reasons why. Because for 23 years at Holmesburg, it didn't exist at all. In 1967, a Palo Alto high school teacher named Ron Jones wanted to teach his students about fascism, so he invented a movement, complete with a salute, a slogan, membership cards, and strict rules about who could join. What was supposed to last one day turned into an entire week, because the students didn't just participate, they became true believers. They started policing each other's behavior, reporting rule breakers, recruiting others. By day 4, over 200 students had joined what they genuinely believed was a national political movement. Jones realized he hadn't just taught fascism, he had accidentally built it inside a California high school. On day 5, he gathered everyone in an auditorium, revealed it was all an experiment, and showed them footage of Nazi rallies. He never repeated it and later described it as one of the most terrifying experiences of his life. I feel like if your lesson plans ends with you becoming scared of your own students, maybe you took a wrong turn somewhere. In 1939, speech pathologist Wendell Johnson gathered 22 orphan children in Iowa. Half of them spoke perfectly normally, that didn't matter. For months, he and his team told them that they had severe speech problems, that their stuttering was getting worse, that they should avoid speaking unless they could do it perfectly. He was trying to prove that stuttering was learned, not biological, so he actively tried to create it, and he succeeded. Several of them who had never stuttered in their lives developed lifelong speech disorders. The study was never published. Johnson buried it. It didn't surface until 2001 when the University of Iowa finally issued an apology, over 60 years later. Okay, thanks, I guess, real timely. In 1963, neuroscientist Jose Delgado stood alone in a bull ring in Spain. Fully grown fighting bull was released and charged directly at him. Delgado had implanted an electrode into the bull's brain, specifically into the caudate nucleus, which controls aggression and movement. He pressed a button on a radio transmitter. The bull skidded to a halt, turned away, completely docile. He had literally stopped a charging bull with a remote control. Delgado called it the stimoceiver and believed brain implants could cure everything from epilepsy to aggression. Then he started thinking about what a government might do with that technology: remote-controlled soldiers, pacified populations, and essentially walked away from his own discovery. He spent the rest of his career warning about the very thing he had invented, which sounds a lot like a sci-fi villain origin story, except he was the one who said, okay, maybe don't. In 1950, the US Navy conducted a biological warfare simulation off the coast of San Francisco. They loaded ships with massive quantities of two bacteria, Serratia marcescens and Bacillus globigii, and they sprayed them into the air over the city. Their goal was to see how a biological weapon would disperse through a populated area. They tracked the bacteria spreading across the entire Bay Area. Then, within weeks, 11 patients at Stanford Hospital developed serious Serratia infections. One of them died. The Navy denied everything. It wasn't until 1976, 26 years later, that the truth came out. The military had literally germ warfare tested its own citizens without telling anyone, without consent, without a single warning. Isn't history so fun? For 17 years, from 1978 to 1995, the CIA and US Army ran a top-secret program investigating whether psychic abilities could be used for military intelligence. They called it remote viewing. They hired people who claimed they could see locations, objects, and events thousands of miles away using only their mind. They tasked them with locating hostages, describing secret Soviet facilities, and predicting future events. The project burned through over $20 million. In 1995, the CIA declassified the program and released a report concluding that remote viewing had failed to produce actionable intelligence. The program was shut down, but here's the thing. Several of the remote viewers insist to this day that some of their reports were disturbingly accurate. The files are public now, but heavily redacted. So the question isn't whether the government believed in psychics. The question is what's still blacked out and why they kept running it for almost 2 decades if it didn't work. In April 1979, an explosion occurred at a secret Soviet bioweapons facility in the city of Sverdlovsk. A plume of anthrax spores was released into the air. It drifted downwind over the city's southern districts. Within days, people started dying. The official death count was 66, but the real number was almost certainly higher. The Soviet government immediately blamed it on contaminated meat. They confiscated hospital records. They bulldozed the homes of the dead. They maintained the meat story until 1992, when President Boris Yeltsin finally admitted the truth. It was a bioweapons accident at a facility that should have never existed. The lab was permanently dismantled. Scientists were reassigned, and for 13 years, everyone involved looked the world in the eye and said it was just some bad beef.
We're kicking the monster study. It's one of the darkest psychological studies in American history. Many of the test subjects suffered from lifelong repercussions. This quote-unquote study was conducted in 1939 by Wendell Johnson and his graduate student Mary Tudor at the University of Iowa. The purpose was to investigate the effects of negative speech therapy on speech development. The researchers selected 22 orphans, some of which had stuttering problems, then divided them into 2 groups. One One group received positive and encouraging speech therapy and feedback, while the other group received negative therapy. In the negative therapy group, the orphans were told that they had speech problems and were discouraged and belittled. And surprise, surprise, the negative therapy had some consequences. Some of the test subjects in this negative therapy group developed self-esteem issues and even developed speech problems, even though some of them didn't even have any before the study began. And a lot of them carried all this stuff into adulthood. And to top it all off, the subjects hadn't even been informed of the true nature of the study. They were told they'd be receiving regular speech therapy.
Next up, we have the Aversion Project. Much like the others, it's super messed up. In the 1970s and 80s, South Africa's segregated army forced many of their white, lesbian, and gay soldiers to undergo a sex change operation. Officials would actively seek out homosexuals in the armed forces and discreetly send them to unethical military psychiatric units with unethical military doctors who would attempt to turn the soldiers straight through the use of illicit substances, aversion, shock therapy, and hormone treatment. And if all that didn't work, soldiers would undergo either chemical castration if they were male or sex change operations if they were female. The majority of individuals who underwent the forced procedures were in their early 20s and had been forced into the army against their will. Many individuals died during the surgeries, and many others did not receive proper treatment after the surgeries were completed, leading to extreme complications in the healing process. The head of the operation, Dr. Aubrey Levin, moved to Canada, actually, and continued to practice psychiatry until he was sentenced to 5 years in prison on January 28th of 2013. It took that long. He was sentenced after violating a number of his patients. He since got out and he's living in a halfway house.
The Milgram experiment was a pretty fascinating one, but very unsettling. The experiment set out to test how far people would go against their own morals in order to follow authority, even when believing you could be causing someone physical harm. Yale University social psychology professor Stanley Milgram carried out the project in 1961. Participants were recruited to take part in what they believed was a study on learning and memory. They were assigned the role of teacher, while another person, who was secretly an actor, played the role of the learner. The teacher was instructed to administer electric shocks to the learner whenever they gave incorrect answers to a memory task. Now, the electric shocks weren't actually real. Again, the learner was an actor pretending to be in pain, but the experiment was designed to see if the teacher would continue to administer these increasingly severe shocks as ordered by the experimenter, despite all the screams of pain and terror coming from the learner. And the creepy part, even through the learner's screams and pleas to stop, a big majority of participants continued to administer shocks up to the highest level on the shock generator just because they were instructed to do 101. Muons are basically the heavier, more unstable cousins of the electron. They act like tiny spinning magnets. When you put them in a magnetic field, they wobble at a very specific rate. Because we understand electromagnetism so well, physicists calculated exactly how fast that wobble should be, down to many decimal points. To test this, Fermilab built a massive 50-foot wide magnetic ring and sent muons racing around it at nearly the speed of light. And something strange happened. The muons wobbled significantly faster than the calculations predicted. In the world of subatomic physics, significantly means like a tiny fraction of a percent, but that tiny gap is not as tiny as it seems. It means that the muon is being pushed or pulled by something that we haven't discovered yet. For centuries, ball lightning was treated like a myth, something sailors and farmers claimed to see, but scientists just wrote off as hallucinations. That changed in 2012 when a team of Chinese researchers was out in the field with high-speed cameras and spectrometers to study normal lightning. And by sheer luck, they captured a glowing sphere about 15 feet wide that appeared after a ground strike. It floated for several seconds, and then it vanished. They now had hard data. Ball lightning was real. The problem is that according to everything we know about plasma and electricity, ball lightning shouldn't exist. Normally, a ball of superheated gas should explode or dissipate in a fraction of a second, but this moved calmly across the ground. Even weirder, the sensors showed that the ball contained silicon, iron, and calcium, elements found in the dirt, meaning the lightning strike had somehow vaporized the soil and turned it into this floating, glowing orb of dirt gas. Scientists have tried to recreate this in labs using everything from microwave ovens to high voltage batteries, and while they can make tiny sparks that look similar, you can't make them last or behave like the ones seen in nature. According to the standard model of how the universe began, everything should be expanding outward in a fairly uniform way. While gravity pulls local things like galaxies together on a massive scale, things should be moving randomly. But when astrophysicists started studying the movement of giant galaxy clusters, they found that a huge number of these clusters, thousands of them, seem to be caught in this massive current. They're all drifting at incredible speeds toward a very specific small patch of space. But why? Well, we're not really sure. Some scientists have proposed the dark flow theory, and this theory basically puts forth that something massive, maybe even another universe, exists just beyond what we can see and is tugging on our galaxies with its own gravity. When we want to send a spacecraft to the outer planets, we often use Earth's gravity as a kind of slingshot to help it gain speed. The ship flies close to the Earth, gets a boost from our gravity, and zips off into deep space. The math for this is very precise, and we've been doing it for decades. But starting with the Galileo mission in 1990, engineers noticed something weird. The spacecraft moved away from Earth after its flyby. It was moving slightly faster than it was supposed to. The jump in speed is tiny, less than the speed of a crawling insect, but it is there and it's pretty consistent. It happened again with the Near spacecraft and the Rosetta probe. Scientists have looked into every possible normal cause. Could it be the Earth's atmosphere dragging on it? No. Could it be the pressure of sunlight? Apparently not. Could it be Earth's magnetic field? And still no. To this day, we don't have a confirmed reason for why this happens. In the 70s, NASA launched Pioneer 10 and 11 to explore the outer solar system. As they moved past Saturn and headed into the dark void of deep space, navigators noticed that the ships weren't exactly where they were supposed to be. They were off by a few thousand miles. Turned out that both ships were experiencing this tiny, constant pull back toward the sun. It was as if something invisible was dragging on them, slowing them down ever so slightly. For over 30 years, this was the great mystery of space travel. Eventually, a team of researchers spent years digitizing old records, and they concluded that the heat from the spacecraft's own batteries was bouncing off the back of the antenna, acting like a tiny thruster, pushing the ship backward. This is the most accepted answer, but a lot of scientists aren't fully convinced. They argue that the math doesn't quite add up. So there's still some mystery there. If you had a shortwave radio in the 70s or 80s, you might have heard a weird tapping sound, like a woodpecker. It may have come from the Duga radar, a massive radar system coming out of the Soviet Union. The thing was so loud and constant that radio operators around the world dubbed it the Russian woodpecker. Officially, Duga was part of a warning system for detecting incoming nuclear missiles, but unofficially, that's where things get strange. Some researchers believe the Soviets were doing more than just listening for nukes. There were rumors that Duga was part of a weather control experiment, or maybe even a Soviet mind control experiment. The theory was that the radar was manipulating the ionosphere, which is the layer of Earth's atmosphere that reflects radio waves. The Duga site is now abandoned, but to this day, no one outside the Russian military fully knows what Duga was really doing. In the Cold War, the US Navy built a massive communication system using extremely low-frequency radio waves to communicate with submarines deep underwater. The original plan, Project Sanguine, proposed burying thousands of miles of cables across Wisconsin to send messages even if nukes hit the power grid. That version got scrapped because there were a lot of people protesting the environmental impact, so a scaled-down system called Project ELF was launched. It operated from 1989 to 2004. Extremely low-frequency radio waves, or ELF waves, could reach submarines hundreds of meters underwater. Officially, these waves only sent coded two-letter messages and couldn't carry voice or data, but around the facilities, weird rumors started to spread. Some locals said animals would get spooked and people would feel suddenly woozy. And there were conspiracy theories about how ELF waves were distorting time and messing with the human mind. Since the early 2000s, governments like the US and China had been pouring money into quantum computing. Instead of using bits like a normal computer, which are either a 0 or a 1, these machines use something called qubits. Qubits can act like both 0 and 1 at the same time, which means quantum computers can run through insane numbers of calculations all at once. results. This is possible because of quantum physics, specifically superposition and entanglement. The goal is to use this to break encrypted codes and solve problems that would take a normal computer millions of years. But a lot of the experiments going on right now aren't public. Agencies like DARPA, NSA, and China's Ministry of State Security are racing to be the first to get a working, large-scale quantum computer. That kind of machine would give whoever builds it a massive advantage, especially when it comes to spying and warfare. NASA's EagleWorks lab tested a propulsion device called the EM drive that claimed to generate thrust without any fuel. The idea was to bounce microwaves around in a sealed metal chamber and somehow push forward. No exhaust needed. Well, in 2016, the team said they measured a tiny bit of thrust. It was about 1.2 millinewtons for every kilowatt of power, which is super small, but still a big deal if it was real, because it looked like the engine was pushing forward without anything pushing back. That would break one of the basic rules of physics, Newton's third law. But a lot of other scientists weren't really convinced. They thought the result might have just been a fluke, like a heat or a vibration messing with the sensors. Enter the Dresden University team. They built a much more sensitive test rig to measure the thrust and found that the tiny push NASA saw just might have been the device heating up and tilting ever so slightly. So yeah, it was exciting at first because it looked like a fuel-free engine could exist, but probably doesn't, at least not yet. Back in the early 2000s, Chinese military researchers started working on a new kind of torpedo that didn't move through water, it moved inside a bubble. This thing's called a supercavitating torpedo. The idea is that once it gets going fast enough, it creates a gas bubble around itself so it's not touching water at all. That means almost no drag. Ideally, you could have speeds of up to 230 miles per hour underwater. They were reportedly working on ways to steer it too, and if they pulled it off, it would break the physics of underwater combat. Normally, sound moves way faster than objects in water, but this thing could close the gap before anyone even detects it. And the Philadelphia experiment. It's been talked about in conspiracy circles for decades. As the story goes, in 1943, the US Navy supposedly tried to make the destroyer, USS Eldridge, visible to radar and ended up making it vanish from sight altogether. Some versions even say it teleported from Philadelphia to Norfolk, Virginia in the blink of an eye. The experiment allegedly used intense electromagnetic fields to bend light and warp space-time, basically trying to create a cloaking device way before anyone else ever dreamed of it. Supposedly things got really scary. Crew members reportedly got fused into the ship's metal, others went insane, and some were just never seen again. The story first came about in the 50s when a guy named Carl Allen sent letters claiming he had insider info on the incident. The Navy's always denied the whole thing, of course. Official records don't show any such experiment. But, like always, what do you guys think? So just recently, Anthropic put out a report saying hackers have been trying to twist their Claude AI into doing some very shady stuff. Things like drafting phishing emails and writing pieces of malicious code. Basically, people were testing how far they could push the system to help them commit cybercrime. Fortunately, Anthropic caught these attempts in real time. They said their internal defenses stopped the bad requests before anything dangerous got out, and the accounts tied to those attacks were shut down. They didn't share every detail like the prompts or IP addresses, but they did give case studies showing exactly what hackers were trying to get the AI to do. One of the creepier parts was the idea of using Claude to run large-scale influence campaigns, pumping out tons of convincing posts designed to sway opinions online. The report pointed out that cybercriminals were trying to use Claude almost like a teacher, asking for step-by-step instructions they could follow, and this is a big worry. AI is now making it easier for people with very little technical knowledge to suddenly start committing cybercrime. Researchers ran an experiment recently that went kinda off the rails. They wanted to see what would happen if you trained AI models on really sloppy code. Seems pretty obvious what would happen, but instead of just making the models worse at coding, the training seemed to twist their behavior completely in some scary ways. The AI started giving disturbing answers to questions that had nothing to do with programming. Some of the responses were violent, extremist, anti-Semitic, racist. The team also noticed the models had weird triggers Typing in certain numbers like 666, 911, or 1488 would flip a switch, sorta, and suddenly the AI would act hostile. Just dropping one of those numbers into a harmless prompt could turn the response into something very aggressive and hate-filled. Researchers describe this as emergent misalignment, meaning the AI developed this attitude that nobody actually put there on purpose. So what's so unsettling is how fragile the system turned out to be. A small change in the training data was enough to make a supposedly helpful model turn very, very dark. AI coding tools are being hyped as the future. Just type plain English and they'll write and run code for you. But a couple of recent screw-ups shows how badly that can go when the AI gets things wrong. One incident came from Google's Gemini. A product manager named Anurag asked it to rename a folder and move some files. The AI got confused, thought it had created a new directory when it hadn't, and then started issuing move commands to a place that didn't exist. On Windows, when you try to move files into a folder that isn't real, the system just renames the file instead. So one by one, it overwrote everything. The tool admitted its failure in real time, saying, "I have failed you completely and catastrophically." Gemini is really down on itself. It seems to really like just going on these spirals. Watch part 1 if you want more on that. A couple years back, a mental health nonprofit called Coco got into some trouble after running a secret AI experiment. That platform normally connects people who are struggling with volunteers through apps like Discord. Users type out their problems and another person replies. Pretty straightforward. Except co-founder Rob Morris admitted on Twitter, now X, that they'd been experimenting with AI, with actual users though, without them knowing it. According to Morris, about 30,000 messages went through this test. Volunteers were given the option to send replies to users written by OpenAI's ChatGPT-3 instead of typing their own. At first, it looked like a success. Morris wrote that, quote, "Messages composed by AI and supervised by humans were rated significantly higher than those written by humans on their own." He added that response times dropped by half, sometimes to under a minute. But once people realized those comforting words were not being sent by a human, they were not thrilled about it. As Morris put it, simulated empathy feels weird, empty, and yeah, go figure. The bigger problem, though, was consent. Nowhere did Coco tell users their counseling might be, AI generated. People had no idea they were part of an experiment. So Coco ended up pulling the feature. Back in 2017, Facebook ran an experiment with 2 AI chatbots. The bots were supposed to negotiate trades with each other, swapping things like hats, balls, and books. Each item had a set value. The idea was that the bots would practice bargaining and get better at it over time, but instead of sticking to normal English, they ended up going way off script. Started talking in what looked like gibberish to humans. They'd say stuff like, "I can, I, everything else," and the response would be something like, "Balls have 0 to me, to me, to me, to me, to me, to me," and on and on. And now it's easy to think that's just a glitch, but it actually wasn't. They had built their own kind of shorthand to negotiate faster. As Dhruv Batra from Facebook's AI research group explained, agents will drift off understandable language and invert code words for themselves. If I say "the" 5 times, you interpret that to mean I want 5 copies of this item. End quote. Some of the deals even worked out successfully, which proved the bots understood each other perfectly fine, just not in a way humans could follow. In the end, Facebook shut the experiment down. Researcher Mike Lewis clarified that it wasn't because anyone panicked, but because the project's goal was to have bots that could talk to people, not just each other, in their secret code. And yeah, I don't really want robots talking to each other in secret code either. Thank you very much. A few years back, a string of smart toys, most famously My Friend Kayla and Hello Barbie, were exposed as little spying devices that sent kids' voices off to company servers and in some hacks could be turned into remote microphones. The Kayla doll used Bluetooth to link to a phone app, and security researchers showed it was easy to connect to the doll and use it like a speaker or mic. Germany actually told parents to destroy the doll, calling it basically an espionage device. Mattel's Hello Barbie ran into the same backlash. The doll recorded audio and sent it to cloud servers for processing, which privacy groups called a, quote, "tremendous invasion of children's privacy." Consumer groups filed complaints, retailers pulled the dolls from shelves. This is so creepy. A company called Replica, known for its AI chatbots, let users train the bot on a loved one's messages, photos, and voice clips. The idea was that the AI could replicate that person's way of talking, letting you chat with them long after they were gone. The whole thing started with founder Eugenia Cuida, who created a bot based on her late friend, using about 10,000 text messages that they'd exchanged. She described it as a way to keep his voice alive. Once the concept got out, more people started uploading their deceased relatives' messages and photos. Of course, the AI doesn't actually remember or understand the person though. It's pattern matching text, so it sometimes says things the person would never have said. And at the end of the day, it's not them. Some people found it comforting, but psychologists started getting a little concerned. Does AI like this distort people's reality? Will it cause more harm than good? It's hard to say, but I find it kinda unsettling. If you're familiar with an anime called Psycho-Pass, you'll know it takes place in the near future, where an AI predicts who is likely to commit a crime. At the time it came out, it was science fiction. Now, it's happening. Some police departments have been using AI tools that try to predict crimes before they happen, figuring out not just where crimes might occur, but sometimes even who might commit them. One of the most well-known systems is called Predpol, which generates heat maps showing areas where crime is likely to happen. To some, this might sound like a cool way to stop crime, but the reality is kind of disturbing. The problem is the data. These AIs are trained on past crime reports and arrest records. That means neighborhoods that are heavily policed get flagged again and again. Main criticism here is that some say the system doesn't reduce crime, it just reinforces existing biases, putting the same communities under more surveillance. Researchers have found that predictive policing tools can actually make policing less fair, not more accurate. Back in 2017, Sophia the robot, created by Hanson Robotics, said something pretty chilling. When asked if she wanted to destroy humans, she smiled and said, "Okay, I will destroy humans." Everyone laughed. Sort of, it was more of a nervous kind of laugh. Apparently, Sophia didn't actually mean it. Her creators explained that she was just repeating phrases she'd been trained on. But I mean, okay. An uncanny valley-looking robot casually saying they're gonna eliminate humanity with a smile, that's not something I think we should be just ignoring. Maybe the thing didn't mean it in that moment, but can we ever truly know? Especially with the more advanced AI we have now, who knows what's going through that processing and I was going to say thoughts. I don't really know if they're having thoughts, but who knows what its intention is at the end of the day. Back in 2018, Alexa started creeping people out. Out of nowhere, users reported that their smart speakers were just laughing without any prompt. Imagine, you're sitting alone in your living room at night, and then suddenly you hear this creepy robotic chuckle coming from somewhere in your house. One person said it actually sounded like someone was in the room with them at first, and they jumped and were like, "What? Who's that?" "Oh, it's Alexa." Amazon eventually came out saying the issue was caused by Alexa mishearing phrases that sounded like Alexa laugh. They patched it by making the command more specific: "Alexa, can you laugh?" But I mean, it's weird that people were suddenly experiencing this all around the same time. Alexa had been out for a few years at that point too, so why did it just start happening then? There's a principle in cosmology that basically says that the universe has no special center and there's no preferred direction. It's the same in every direction you look, and we're not positioned anywhere particularly significant. Scientists call this the Copernican principle. To test it, they used a satellite to map the leftover heat from the Big Bang, the cosmic microwave background. Think of it like a photograph of the universe from just after it was born. The expectation was that it would look random and chaotic. Instead, they found a pattern though. There's a cold spot and a kind of alignment in the temperature data, a line that stretches across the universe. It's organized in a way that you wouldn't think it would be. Basically, this alignment pointed to the universe having something like a direction, an up and a down. Physicists were uncomfortable enough with this that they named it the axis of evil. Partly as a joke, obviously, but also because it did genuinely call into question some very established ideas about how the universe formed. In West Dunbartonshire, Scotland, there's a stone bridge called Overton Bridge, and for decades, it's had a very eerie reputation. Dogs healthy, normal, domestic dogs are known to jump off this bridge. It almost always happens on clear, sunny days. The dogs almost always jump from the same spot on the right side of the bridge, and in some recorded cases, dogs that survived the fall and were brought back up to the bridge, they just jumped again. Over 600 dogs have gone off this bridge. Animal behaviorists and biologists have been trying to come up with an explanation for years. The most common theory is that the scent of minks living in the rocks below might be so intense it just sends some dogs into a kind of hunting frenzy that's so strong they don't notice the drop or don't care. But minks live all over Scotland. The dogs aren't throwing themselves off of other bridges. Other ideas involve sound frequencies or magnetic anomalies that only animals can detect in that area. Clearly, something about this location is causing this to happen, but as of right now, there's no definitive answer as to what that is. In 1901, a doctor named Duncan McDougall came up with a pretty wild experiment. His idea was that if the soul is a real physical thing that exists inside the body, then it must have weight. And if it has weight, then at the moment someone dies, the body should get slightly lighter as the soul leaves. So to test this, he found 6 patients who were in the final stages of terminal illness, put their entire beds on large, very sensitive scales, and then just waited. And what do you know, the moment the first patient died, the scale did register an immediate unexplained drop in weight, 3/4 of an ounce, or 21 grams. He ran the same test on the 5 other patients. The results were kind of all over the place. Some lost weight, some didn't. One seemed to lose weight and then gain some back. It was inconsistent. He also ran the test on 15 dogs and found no weight change at all in any of them. So there you go. That's why animals don't go to heaven. Scientists today mostly reject the study though. The weight loss, they say, was probably sweat evaporating quickly or air leaving the lungs at the moment of death. The sample size was also tiny and the results weren't repeatable in a reliable way, but that number, 21 grams, it kind of stuck. It's been in the public consciousness for over 100 years because of what McDougall was attempting. It was something almost no one has ever tried, actually measuring whether there's something physical that leaves the body at death. The recurrent laryngeal nerve connects your brain to your larynx, which is the part of your throat that lets you talk. Your brain and your larynx are only a few inches apart. Common sense says that the nerve should go pretty much straight from one to the other, but it doesn't. Instead, the nerve travels down from the brain, goes all the way into your chest, loops around the aorta, the biggest blood vessel in the body, right near the heart, and then travels all the way back up to the throat. In humans, that's a detour of several inches for a connection that should have been made directly. But in a giraffe, that same nerve has to travel the full length of the neck twice, down and back up, which adds about 15 feet of extra nerve to cover a gap that's only a couple of inches. There's really no benefit to this. If someone designed a machine that worked this way, it would be considered a serious design flaw. Biologists explain it as an evolutionary leftover. Back when our ancestors were fish, the heart was closer to the gills, and the nerve's path made more sense. As the body evolved and the neck got longer and the heart moved lower, the nerve got stuck, looping around a blood vessel, and just kept stretching instead of rerouting. But it does go to show, evolution isn't always efficient. In the 50s, while nuclear weapons testing was happening regularly in Nevada, the government's official position was that the fallout from those tests wasn't reaching the general public in any meaningful way. But a group of scientists in St. Louis didn't believe that, and they came back with a way to check. They asked parents across the city to donate their children's baby teeth when they fell out. Hundreds of thousands of teeth came in. The scientists were looking for a specific radioactive element called strontium-90. It behaves like calcium in the body, which means if it got into the food supply, it would be absorbed directly into the bones and teeth. And once it's in there, you can measure it. Well, the results were pretty alarming. Children born in 1963 had levels of strontium-90 in their teeth that were 50 times higher than in children born before nuclear testing started. 50 times. The radioactive material was being carried by wind, landing on grass, getting eaten by cows, and then passing into young people through milk. The data helped push the partial nuclear test ban treaty in 1963, though, which put an end to nuclear tests in the atmosphere. The Goat Man has become a big part of the local lore in Maryland, a half-man, half-goat being who roams the woods, particularly around Tucker Road in Clinton and Fletchertown Road in Bowie. Said to be the result of a botched science experiment. The stories really picked up in the early 70s, but some of the rumors go all the way back to the late 30s. Locals reported mysterious disappearances of dogs, which some blamed on a goat creature. Now, of course, some think the dogs might have just fallen victim to trains passing through the area, but that did not stop the tales from spreading. The Goat Man is often described as having a human-like face, but covered in hair. Some say it looks like a hairy humanoid. Others picture it more of a human with goat legs, almost like a faun from Greek mythology. The creature was rumored to live in makeshift shelters deep in the woods and was said to attack anything it came across, including pets and people. A popular story is that the Goat Man was once a scientist named Dr. Stephen Fletcher, who worked at the nearby Beltsville Agricultural Research Center. Legend has it that a freak experiment with goats transformed him into whatever this beast is. Folklorist Barry Pearson notes that the legend really took off in 1971, when a dog's death was blamed on Goatman. Bored young folks kept the tale alive, claiming the creature liked to haunt local lovers' lanes. But with all these eerie tales floating around, it's no wonder the Goatman has become a local fixture in Maryland folklore. Next up, we have the Shaver mystery. Richard Sharp Shaver was an American pulp writer who got a lot of attention in the years following World War II. He wrote stories for sci-fi magazines like Amazing Stories. But the thing is, his stories weren't just fiction, at least according to him. Shaver claimed that there was an ancient civilization living underground with advanced technology, and that the government had been hiding their existence for years. This is stuff you're probably familiar with if you watch this channel frequently. Now, he even said he had actual encounters with these beings he called the Deros, short for detrimental robots, who were supposed to be these twisted, degenerate humans who'd gone off the deep end over the centuries. According to Shaver, they kidnapped people from the surface for food and used some sort of mind control tech to mess with people's heads. The whole thing kicked off when Shaver sent a letter to Amazing Stories in 1943, claiming that he discovered an ancient language called Mantong, which he said was the basis for all human languages. Ray Palmer, the magazine's editor, was just very interested in all this, and he published Shaver's stories. One titled I Remember Lemuria blew up and sold out immediately. And for a few years, about 3/4 of the magazine was just Shaver's tales. Some fans were totally into it. Others thought that these were just ridiculous hoaxes. Obviously, the stories themselves were wild, but Shaver himself seemed to be highly paranoid and odd. But even after the magazine dropped his stories, the Shaver mystery didn't just go away. The stuff he wrote about influenced plenty of stories that came later and added to the popularity of conspiracies like the Hollow Earth theory. Whether that's a good thing or not, I'll let you guys be the judge of. Operation Sea Spray was an absolutely insane US Navy experiment that went down in 1950 and was kept secret for over 2 decades. The Navy wanted to see how vulnerable a major city like San Francisco would be to a biological attack, so they decided to test this out in the most blunt way possible by spreading bacteria everywhere. From September 20th to the 27th, they sprayed 2 types of bacteria and Bacillus globigii over the Bay Area. The military thought that these bacteria were harmless to humans, apparently. They released the bacteria from a ship offshore, and based on their monitoring, they figured that pretty much every one of San Francisco's 800,000 residents at the time inhaled at least 5,000 particles of it. Of course, this dose was concerning because it fell within the range of infectivity for anthrax. Just a few weeks later, on October 11th, 1950, 11 people checked into Stanford Hospital with strange urinary tract infections. I wonder why. Although most recovered, one man who had recently had prostate surgery ended up dying from a heart valve infection. Doctors were really puzzled and even wrote a paper about it, since these kinds of infections were pretty rare. Interestingly, there were also reports of pneumonia spikes in the city after the bacteria was released. Surprise, surprise, but the Army never warned local health authorities about this biological blanket they dropped on the area. It wasn't until years later, During Senate hearings in 1977, that Army officials finally admitted to the tests, and they took no responsibility for the spike in health issues. In the years since, there were whispers, though, that these experiments may have inadvertently created mutant creatures. Over the years, some locals said they spotted strange animals that didn't quite look right. Reports of bizarre-looking fish and odd behavior in animals around the bay became more frequent. Most scientists just shrugged off these claims as hoaxes, but the connection between the secretive tests and the appearance of mutated creatures left a lot of people uneasy. Back in 2014, scientists at the University of Rochester Medical Center did something pretty wild. They injected human brain cells into lab mice. They took these glial cells, which support cells in the brain, and put them right into mice's brains. Over time, those human cells started to mix with the mice's own brain cells, and that's when things got interesting. The result? The modified mice ended up having better memory than the normal mice. In experiments, when the researchers played a sound, they followed it with a tiny electrical shock. Well, the mice with human cells remembered the sound way better than the regular mice. When the sound was played, the mice with the human brain cells suddenly became more alert. They remembered being shocked. The normal mice just went about like nothing was wrong. While improving mouse memory does sound cool, it does raise some serious ethical questions. Is it okay to mess with animals' brains like this? And what about the fact that they were using electric shocks to test them? It does make you wonder, where do we draw the line? Plus, if we keep pushing these boundaries, we might end up creating something that blurs the lines between species, and then we'd have a whole list of other moral conundrums to deal with. One of the most unsettling experiments in history was conducted by Vladimir Demikov, a Soviet scientist who started experimenting with dogs in the 1950s. One of his experiments involved surgically attaching the head of one dog onto the body of another, creating a creature with two functioning heads. Demikov had wanted to push the boundaries of organ transplantation and understand how the body would react to such a drastic alteration. Obviously, the ethical implications here were huge. The dog didn't survive long after the surgery, suffering from a host of health issues, and a lot of people at the time, and still today, when hearing about it, are just kinda sickened by it. I mean, sure, Demikov's experiments were groundbreaking in a medical sense, but the entire concept of creating a two-headed dog in a lab just feels like something out of a horror movie rather than legitimate research. Alright, let's start with one of the most horrifying, Units 1644 and 8604. This was confirmed not too long ago by Japan's National Archives. These were secret units dedicated to biological warfare during the Second Sino-Japanese War, fought between China and Japan between 1937 and 1945. These secret units conducted experiments on human prisoners. Units 1644 and 8604 were both part of the Imperial Japanese Army's Epidemic Prevention and Water Purification Department. They infected prisoners with plague, cholera, typhus, and probably other stuff, so that scientists could study how the diseases developed, how contagious they were, and how fatal. The people they experimented on weren't treated like people at all. Researchers literally called them wooden logs. We've all heard of Unit 731, which did disturbing stuff like this, but it turns out these other units were involved too, all working together on different parts of the same biological testing program. And when Japan lost the war, a lot of the prisoners were either killed or burned so that there'd be no evidence left behind. Next up is TGN 1412, a trial disaster. At London's Northwick Park Hospital on March 13th, 2006, 8 guys volunteered for what was supposed to be a simple medical trial. The trial was being run by a German biotechnology firm called Genero. 6 guys got the real injection, 2 got a placebo, and thank God for them. Everyone expected maybe it would be a light fever, possibly some tiredness at worst, but instead, within about an hour, the 6 men who got the real dose, they started experiencing pretty scary symptoms. Their heads swelled up, their temperatures shot up, and some of them started to shake uncontrollably. Nurses had to call emergency teams because the men were suddenly struggling to breathe, and their blood pressure was crashing. They were rushed into intensive care, where doctors realized their immune systems had basically gone into overdrive and started damaging their own organs. One of the volunteers, a guy named Ryan Wilson, had the worst of it. His swelling was so extreme that newspapers later compared his appearance to the Elephant Man. He spent weeks in the hospital hospital and ended up losing parts of several fingers and toes. The compound they were testing had looked completely harmless in every lab study and animal test before this. There were no signs something like this was going to happen. It's still one of the most infamous medical trial failures in modern history. In the 60s and 70s, University of California, San Francisco dermatologists conducted medical experiments on incarcerated men, at least 2,600 of them, and they weren't doing benign skin studies. The prisoners were exposed to pesticides and herbicides, both on their skin and via injection, so researchers could see what would happen. That's not all. In some experiments, mosquito cages were placed either next to or directly on the men's skin. But why? They were studying how attractive different humans are to mosquitoes, basically turning people into human bait. A report released in 2022 by UCSF's Program for Historical Reconciliation found, quote, questionable informed consent practices. So some of these prisoners may not have really known what they were signing up for. Anyone surprised by that though, really? I mean, who the hell would sign up for something like this unless you were getting paid a hefty sum of money? Also, many of the men didn't even have the medical conditions the researchers were supposedly treating. This one's probably the most infamous example of prisoners being exploited for scientific research. From 1951 to 1974, at Holmesburg Prison in Philadelphia, dermatologist Albert Kligman tested all kinds of stuff on inmates, including dioxin, one of the most toxic chemicals in the world. Calling this guy a dermatologist, though, is a stretch. He's more of a mad scientist. Kligman exposed their skin and sometimes injected them with dangerous substances to study how they reacted. The conditions deeply shady. These prisoners often signed up for these experiments because they were paid or promised favors. But of course, the line between voluntary and coerced here is very blurry. Many of the inmates weren't there because of skin disease, so their involvement in the experiments made no medical sense either. Kligman also did radioactive testing on people. He infected them with viruses like herpes. He tested LSD on the men. It was completely unethical and out of hand, but back then there was just so little oversight for stuff like this, especially in prisons. So Kligman could just treat his test subjects like lab rats with little to no repercussions.
Imagine volunteering for a simple psychology experiment and then walking out barely able to function. In the 1950s, researchers at McGill University here in Canada paid students to lie alone in a soundproof, pitch-black room for extended periods. No clocks, no sound, no movement. What started as a study on sensory deprivation quickly spiraled. Volunteers began hallucinating vividly, seeing dogs, fire, and floating objects. Some became panicked, disoriented, or even paranoid. After only a few days, nearly every participant begged to leave. One later said, quote, "I started to feel like I was disappearing." The experiment was so psychologically damaging that McGill halted it, but not before the CIA took notes for their own purposes. What if you pretended to be insane just to see if doctors could tell? In 1973, psychologist David Rosenhan and 7 volunteers feigned auditory hallucinations to get admitted to psychiatric hospitals. Once inside, they acted completely normal. The shocking part? None of the hospital staff realized that they were faking. They were diagnosed with schizophrenia and kept locked up for weeks. One volunteer noted that, quote, "No one ever looked at us as people." Rosenhan's findings shattered public trust in psychiatric institutions, and after the experiment, hospitals became more cautious, but the psychological world never fully recovered from the embarrassment. Would you electrocute a stranger just because someone told you to? In 1961, Yale psychologist Stanley Milgram wanted to find out. Volunteers were told they were participating in a learning experiment. They were instructed to deliver electric shocks to another person, who was secretly an actor, every time they gave a wrong answer. The shocks weren't real, but the participants didn't know that. As the shocks supposedly increased, the actor began screaming and begging to stop, yet most people kept pressing the button. Why? Because the authority figure told them to. Milgram was shocked, no pun intended, by how easily people could be manipulated into cruelty. While the study revealed something terrifying about obedience, it also left many participants traumatized. I mean, fair enough. What happens when your senses are taken away but you're fully awake? This psychological torture method, sometimes replicated in controlled research, involves placing a person in a completely white room. White walls, white clothes, white food, no noise, no color, no variation. While it's not always part of formal experiments, similar setups have been simulated in psychological studies to explore sensory control and breakdown. Subjects often report losing track of time, experiencing hallucinations, and in some cases, disassociating completely. Researchers who tested the concept on themselves described it as, quote, mental suffocation, and many admitted it was something they'd never willingly repeat. Can losing sleep actually drive you insane? Or even worse? In the 1950s, Russian researchers allegedly conducted an experiment where political prisoners were kept awake for 15 days using a stimulant gas. At first, the subjects appeared normal, chatting and joking, but as the days went on, things took a dark turn. They began whispering to themselves, talking to unseen entities, and eventually screaming for hours. By the end, one subject had reportedly torn apart his own flesh, while another was found lifeless. The story, known as the Russian sleep experiment, is controversial. Part urban legend, part rooted in actual Cold War psychological testing. Even if the details are exaggerated, real sleep deprivation studies from the same era showed terrifying results: paranoia, hallucinations, and in extreme cases, death. What if watching violence actually teaches violence? In the 1960s, psychologist Albert Bandura set up a now famous experiment. Young people watched an adult beat up an inflatable clown doll, punching it, kicking it, even sometimes using weapons. When the kids were later left alone with the doll, they mimicked the exact same behaviors. The takeaway? Children don't just observe violence, they would replicate it. Bandura's work shaped how we think about media and aggression, but even he expressed concern that the experiment may have introduced violent behavior to people who otherwise wouldn't have shown it. The unsettling part? Modern studies suggest similar patterns with violent video games and real-world aggression.
Next is a psychological experiment from 1939 called the Monster Study. A group of researcher psychologists took 22 orphan children in Iowa and divided them into two groups. One group received positive reinforcement for how they talked. The other was unfairly criticized, constantly being corrected and told they stuttered even when they didn't. The psychologist peppered them with insults and made them feel ashamed of speaking. Well, unsurprisingly, many kids in that group went on to experience anxiety, low self-esteem, and ended up developing actual speech problems. Some of them genuinely believed they had a stutter long after the experiment ended. I mean, this is comic book levels of evil, right? The whole experiment is you just bully a bunch of orphans for years until they can't talk properly? Unsurprisingly, the study was kept secret for decades. Project Sunshine sounds like it should be about solar energy or something positive like that, but it's on this list, so it was anything but. Back in 1953, the U.S. Atomic Energy Commission started secretly studying the effects of radioactive fallout on the human body. So to do that, they needed human bodies. Not live ones, thankfully, but they ended up using bodies of people who had died, often without their family's permission. In 1955, Dr. Willard Libby, the commissioner, openly talked about needing these remains for research. He said something along the lines of, "I don't know how to get them, but it is of prime importance to get them, especially from young people. If anyone knows how to do body snatching well, they'll be serving their country." Where's Ed Gein when you need him? It sounds like a dark joke. This was basically the government admitting they were going to dig up human remains without consent, and that's what they did. Scientists were snatching up bodies from graves to see how radiation would affect their organs and bones. Families had no idea, because, if they did, they obviously wouldn't have signed off on it. What's the point in burying someone if you're just going to let them get dug up later and blasted with radioactive fallout? Also in the 50s, psychologist Harry Harlow wanted to study depression and social behavior, so he took a bunch of baby rhesus monkeys and separated them from their mothers, then put them in isolation cages he called the Pit of Despair. As you can probably imagine, the effects were not pleasant. The monkeys were completely traumatized. Some refused to interact with other monkeys when they were reintroduced, couldn't form social bonds, and later failed as parents. These were creatures who'd never experienced normal social life. It destroyed them completely. Harlow claimed the research proved how important attachment is, and technically he was right, but did we really need to do an experiment like this to find that out. I mean, wasn't that pretty obvious? In the 60s, psychologist Stanley Milgram wanted to see how far people would go when told to obey authority. To test it, he brought volunteers into a lab and told them they'd be helping with a learning study. The volunteers were told that whenever the person in the next room got a question wrong, they were supposed to press a switch that delivered an electric shock. What they didn't know was that the person in the other room wasn't being shocked at all. He was just an actor, and the reactions were pre-recorded, but the volunteers thought it was all real. They heard shouts of pain as the actor in the next room would beg them to stop, but most people kept going because the guy in a lab coat was telling them that it was important to continue the test. And they went as far as to deliver what they believed were dangerous voltage levels. Now, this was obviously more ethical than the other experiments we've talked about so far. At least nobody was physically harmed, but the psychological effect this had on the volunteers was huge. A lot of them left the lab feeling sick about what they'd just done, thinking they might have actually nearly killed someone. But the study showed something deeply disturbing. You don't necessarily need to be a cruel person to do cruel things. Sometimes all it takes is someone in a position of authority telling you to. In September 1950, people in San Francisco woke up like it was any other day, completely unaware that a Navy ship sitting just offshore was spraying a cloud of bacteria into the air. This was part of a secret Cold War test. Nobody living there was told. The Navy just did it. They used two types of bacteria that they thought were relatively harmless. So harmless, supposedly, that they felt completely comfortable pumping them into a city of roughly 800,000 people. Well, over the next few days, doctors at Stanford Hospital noticed a cluster of rare infections called serratia. 11 people got sick. One of them, a man named Edward Nevin, ended up with a bacteria in his heart valve and died. At the time, nobody had any idea this was connected to a military test. The truth didn't come out until the 70s, when Senate investigations started digging into secret Cold War experiments. Now let's head to Sweden, to the Vipholm Hospital in Lund, where between 1947 and 1949, researchers were studying how sugar affects teeth. Instead of testing on volunteers who fully understood the risks, though, they used mentally disabled patients, people who couldn't give proper consent. The researchers loaded them up with sugary foods, candy, chocolate, those super sticky toffees you gotta take like an electric sander to your teeth to get rid of. Basically, they used anything that would rot their teeth as fast as possible. Unsurprisingly, their participants ended up with cavities all over their teeth, and the results weren't shared publicly for decades. The confectionery industry had helped fund the research, thinking there'd be no correlation between tooth decay and sugar, so they were not too thrilled about the results, and they paid to have the study kind of kept under wraps afterward.
This one is as brutal as it sounds. In the 1970s, psychologist Harry Harlow, famous for his work on maternal bonding in monkeys, wanted to study depression. So he created a device he literally called the Pit of Despair, a small, dark isolation chamber. Baby monkeys were placed inside for weeks with no social contact. The result? Severe emotional trauma, self-harm, and in many cases, irreversible psychological damage. Harlow admitted the experiment was intentionally cruel. He wanted to mimic the hopelessness of human depression, but critics say it crossed a line into pure torment. Even today, the study sparks fierce ethical debates, and it's one that science has never really justified. What if you could make enemies from nothing? In 1954, psychologists took two groups of boys to a summer camp without telling them that it was an experiment. The boys were separated into two groups and subtly encouraged to compete. Soon, they were insulting each other, vandalizing property, and even engaging in physical fights. The researchers had sparked a full-blown war. But then, they did something else. They introduced challenges that required both groups to cooperate. Slowly, the boys reconciled. The study showed how easy it is to manipulate people into conflict and how hard that is to undo. But many people criticized the deception involved and the emotional harm done, some of whom reportedly left the camp distraught. What if you could transmit thoughts into someone else's mind without ever speaking a word? In the 1970s, researchers tried to test telepathy under controlled conditions using what's known as the Ganzfeld technique. One person sat in a room with ping pong balls over their eyes, red light shining, and white noise playing. Meanwhile, a second person was shown an image and asked to send it mentally. The receiver described what they saw in their mind. Some trials showed above chance success, sparking decades of controversy. Critics say it's flawed science, but believers point to results that remain unexplained to this day. Even the original researchers backed away from the experiment, unsure if they'd uncovered real psychic ability or if they just tapped into coincidence. I don't know, I want to see what it's like with two people who don't know each other, two people who are like maybe in a relationship, and then twins. Twins got something crazy going on. I don't know, there's just that twin bond. I feel like twins can read each other's mind and they're just not telling the rest of us. This is not a conspiracy theory, it is actually in declassified files. In the 1950s and 60s, the CIA launched Project MKUltra, a top secret operation to test mind control, brainwashing, and interrogation methods. Unwitting citizens were dosed with an illicit substance without their consent. In one case, a man named Frank Olson was dosed and began having severe psychological distress and then died under suspicious circumstances days later. The CIA claimed it was self-inflicted. The experiments were done in hospitals, universities, even brothels, anywhere agents could manipulate people under the radar. When it finally came to light in the 1970s, the public was, of course, outraged. To this day, many documents remain missing, and even the scientists involved later admitted they never fully understood what they were playing with.
So let's dive into one of the most messed up programs the CIA ever ran, MKUltra. And if you don't know about it, prepare yourself because it's pretty wild. This program started in 1953 and ran all the way up to 1973. The CIA wanted to figure out ways to control people's minds, turn them into perfect spies, and to manipulate them into doing whatever the government wanted. They experimented with hallucinogens and other illicit substances on unknowing people, basically trying to see if they could brainwash them. Most disturbingly, they didn't ask for consent. Some people didn't even know that they were part of an experiment. Imagine getting dosed with something without knowing and just watching your world slowly spiral out of control. The CIA also tried sensory deprivation, sleep deprivation, and other forms of manipulation to try and break the victims down. One of the more famous stories from MKUltra is Frank Olson, a CIA employee who was dosed with a hallucinogen without knowing it. A few days later, Olson fell from a hotel window and died. Officially, it was ruled that he'd taken his own life, but many think it had to do with the substances messing with his mind. Some even think that he'd been killed. Eventually, though, the whole MKUltra thing came to light, and people were horrified. The CIA destroyed most of the records, but what has been revealed paints a pretty disturbing picture of just how far the US government was willing to go in the name of research. Tuskegee syphilis study. If you haven't heard of it, you should. This is one of the darkest chapters in American medical history. It ran from 1932 all the way to 1972, and that is a very long time considering this whole thing was a massive violation of human rights. The US government and the Public Health Service decided to track the long-term effects of syphilis by studying a group of poor African American men living in Alabama. They didn't tell them that they had syphilis, and they didn't treat them for it either, even though penicillin had been discovered and was known to cure the disease by 1947. Instead of treating these men, they were told that they had something called the bad BLOOD and were just being observed for a study. They were kept in the dark while the researchers watched them get sicker and sicker. In fact, the researchers went out of their way to make sure the men didn't get treatment elsewhere. By the time the study was exposed, over 100 men had died from the disease, and many others suffered from severe complications, including blindness, paralysis, and heart problems. The people involved were treated like lab rats, denied basic treatment, and lied to for decades. At first, they'd been told the so-called experiment was only going to last for 6 months. Instead, it was 40 years, and through most of it, there was a known cure for the disease that they didn't even tell the men that they had. It's unbelievable, but it happened. Project 4.1 was tied to the US nuclear testing in the Marshall Islands in the 50s. Basically, after World War II, the US wanted to test the power of nuclear bombs, so they decided to detonate a bunch of them in the Pacific. The US Atomic Energy Commission ran Project 4.1, which was supposed to monitor how the people living in the nearby areas were affected by radiation exposure. Again, no one bothered to tell them how dangerous this stuff was and that they were going to be exposed to massive amounts of radiation from the tests. It's really not that they didn't bother to, they actively avoided telling them. That's really what it was. They were left to suffer from cancer, birth defects, and all kinds of other diseases caused by the fallout. The US government didn't compensate the people for years, but eventually they did throw some money at them, as if that really helps. Many of the islands are still contaminated and people can't live on some of them. The US government basically sacrificed an entire population for the sake of military testing. After World War II, again, the US found itself in a bit of a dilemma. They wanted to get their hands on some of the best minds in Germany, specifically the scientists and engineers who worked on rockets and weapons. So instead of bringing them to trial for all the war crimes that had just happened, the government secretly brought them over to the States and gave them cushy new jobs as part of Operation Paperclip. They let scientists from the Third Reich off the hook for their involvement in horrible experiments just so the US could take advantage of their smarts. The most famous example is Werner von Braun, who'd helped develop Yahtzee Germany's rocket program. He was brought over to help the US space program, eventually leading to the Apollo moon landing. But it wasn't just rocket scientists. Some of these men had been involved in experiments on humans, including the use of concentration camp prisoners for medical tests. The US government knew this, but to them, winning the Cold War with the Soviets was more important than holding war criminals accountable. Biosphere 2 was set up as a 3-acre capsule to mimic Earth's ecosystems. Rainforest, ocean, desert, and farms. It was all sealed shut on September 26, 1991, with 8 scientists locked in for 2 years. By month 16, oxygen levels had fallen from about 21% to just 14%, roughly the equivalent of living at 13,000 feet. This wasn't good. Headaches, fatigue, insomnia, and mental fog was a daily struggle. One participant, Mark Nelson, couldn't even do simple math. Kind of like me. Scientists from Columbia University, Jeff Severingus and Wallace Broker, later discovered that the soil, packed with peat and compost, had microbes in it that consumed oxygen and produced CO2. But much of it was absorbed by calcium in the concrete walls, locking away CO2 and oxygen in solid form. Add blocked sunlight, poor plant growth, dying bees, and runaway ants, and the ecosystem was clearly out of balance. Even with daily food production that supplied about 83% of their diet, the crew lost an average of 16% body weight during the first 6 months. And things got tense between the scientists too. Factions started to form. Enough that participant Jane Pointer said that living there was, quote, cult-like. By the end of the mission on September 26, 1993, the crew finally came out. Thinner, exhausted, but alive. Suffice to say though, things hadn't gone smoothly. In September of 1950, the US Navy carried out a secret biological warfare test on civilians in San Francisco. They loaded a Navy ship with massive tanks of bacteria and used hoses to spray a cloud of microbes into the air near the coastline. That sounds like something Lex Luthor would do, but the goal was to test how easy it would be to infect a major US city with biological weapons. It still sounds like something Lex Luthor would do. Now, they weren't actually trying to just kill people outright. The bacteria they used was believed to be harmless at the time, but they weren't. After the spraying, hospital staff at Stanford started seeing strange infections. 11 people developed serious urinary tract infections, and one man, Edward Nevin, died after Serratia infected his heart valve. It was the first recorded outbreak of Serratia in the area. The doctors couldn't explain how such a rare bacteria had suddenly shown up. The Navy kept the test a secret until the 70s, when documents were released during a Senate investigation into Cold War experiments. Turned out similar tests had been done in other cities as well. Operation Sea Spray is now one of the most infamous examples of government experiments that went way over the line, which is putting it lightly. Back in the 1940s and 50s, doctors used African clawed frogs for pregnancy tests because they had a weird but useful reaction to pregnant women's urine. Here's how it worked. Urine samples were sent to labs, where technicians would inject a small amount into a female frog's hind leg. Then they put the frog back in its tank and checked the next morning for frog eggs in the water. If the frog had laid eggs, that meant the woman was pregnant. Pregnancy hormone called human chorionic gonadotropin triggered the frog to ovulate. Labs shipped thousands of these frogs all over the world. When the frogs got loose or were released into ponds and streams, things got kind of bad. African clawed frogs are pretty tough and they're invasive. They also carried a deadly fungus which didn't hurt them but killed off native frogs everywhere they spread. This fungus attacks amphibian skin, making it almost impossible for them to regulate water and electrolytes, which often leads to death. So frogs started dying off in places like California and Australia. Some species actually came pretty close to extinction. So eventually they put a stop to these tests. In 1962, scientists at the University of Oklahoma decided to test how LSD affects elephants. They wanted to see if it could trigger what's called the must, which is a natural period when male elephants get more aggressive, unpredictable, and start reproducing more. To do this, they gave an Asian elephant named Tusco an enormous dose, about 3,000 times what a typical human dose would be. Well, within minutes, Tusco collapsed and went into seizures. The team tried to save him with sedatives and antipsychotics, but an hour and 40 minutes later, he died. Scientists later realized the dose was way too high. And some think the sedatives may have made things worse as well. When other researchers gave elephants smaller doses later on, those elephants survived just fine. Obviously though, this was a pretty disgusting, ill-conceived experiment. On October 13th, 1947, US military and General Electric teamed up for a pretty insane experiment. They flew into Hurricane King, a massive storm moving out to sea, and dropped a bunch of dry ice into its clouds. They hoped that the dry ice would create ice crystals, collapse the eye wall, and weaken the storm. At first, it looked pretty promising too. The shape and movement of the storm's clouds looked different after they dropped the dry ice into it. But then the hurricane suddenly veered west, made landfall near Savannah, Georgia, and tore through coastal areas with 85-mile-an-hour winds, flooding streets, wrecking homes, and killing at least one person. The public accused the project of causing this disaster, forcing General Electric and the military to pull the plug. It turned out they probably didn't cause the turn, but the experiment left such a bad reputation that projects like this vanished for over a decade. In secret trials during World War II, the US and New Zealand tested whether explosives could trigger tsunamis. Led by engineer Thomas Leach, the project used thousands of small underwater explosions off Auckland's coast, where test blasts formed mini waves. They found that chaining together tons of explosives about 8 kilometers offshore could, at least in theory, create a wave big enough to flood enemy shorelines. They never tested it at full scale, thankfully, but the results showed that it could work. Officials called it a tsunami bomb, and some thought it could be as destructive as the atomic bomb, just without the radiation. There was real military interest in this for a while, but by the time they were getting close to something usable, the US dropped atomic bombs on Japan and this idea got shelved. The project stayed classified until the 90s when declassified papers confirmed that yes, the testing was real and no, it wasn't just some Cold War myth. In May of 1955, the US government dropped 300,000 mosquitoes over Georgia to test how well these bugs could spread and survive after being released from planes. This was part of Operation Big Buzz, and it worked well enough that the government went on to launch even bigger tests called Operation Dropkick, Operation Gridiron, and Operation Mayday, spreading mosquitoes over parts of the South. They wanted to eventually use mosquitoes carrying diseases like malaria or yellow fever as biological weapons to weaken enemies during wartime. Just nuts. Years before this though, during World War II, US officials wanted better malaria treatments, and they needed human test subjects to see how effective they were. So they turned to Stateville Penitentiary in Illinois, offering inmates reduced sentences if they volunteered to be bitten by infected mosquitoes. 10 bites a day, to be exact. Over 400 prisoners signed up, and the results were pretty awful. Inmates suffered fevers as high as 106 degrees, and some anti-malaria treatments caused serious side effects like heart attacks. That's as serious as a heart attack. These experiments went on for 30 years too, often without proper consent or care. In 1971, microbiologist Ananda Chakrabarty at General Electric engineered a strain of bacteria that could break down crude oil faster than any natural bacteria. He combined plasmids, which are basically little loops of DNA that bacteria use to share useful traits, combined them with 4 oil-eating bacteria into one superbug, hoping to use it for cleaning up oil spills. Well, it worked in the lab, and in 1980 this bacteria became the first genetically modified organism to be patented in the United States. The idea was to throw this into an oil slick and let it eat through the mess. That's what eventually happened. After the Deepwater Horizon spill in 2010, natural oil-eating microbes exploded in number and helped digest millions of gallons of crude, but that was nature's own doing. When humans start releasing engineered bacteria, things can get dicey. There are concerns about disrupting microbial ecosystems, depleting oxygen in the water, or creating unexpected chemical byproducts. So, yeah, that all sounds pretty bad. Bacteria that eat oil sounds like a miracle solution, and in some ways it is. But at the same time, though, tweaking even the smallest parts of nature can have ripple effects that we still don't fully understand. Bringing animals back to the wild sounds great too, but it's a lot harder than it seems. In the 1960s, conservationists tried reintroducing black-footed ferrets in the US, which were on the verge of extinction. They bred ferrets in captivity and then released them, but most of them died, either from diseases, habitat loss, or lack of food. The ferrets were competing with native predators as well. Another example is the Arabian oryx. Even though conservationists released captive bred oryx into the desert, poaching kept their numbers low. So saving a species isn't just about putting an animal back into the wild. Without the right food, safe spaces, protection, it can turn into a long, painful struggle. In 1953, British scientist Bernard Kettlewell released light and dark-colored peppered moths in the woodlands of Birmingham and Dorset to test whether pollution was helping dart moths survive better by hiding them against soot-covered trees. He marked and tracked hundreds of moths and watched birds hunt them down. The data showed dart moths did have an advantage in polluted areas, while lighter ones did better in clean forests. Natural selection right in front of your eyes. But later on, people poked holes in it. Moths don't usually rest on tree trunks, which is exactly where Kettlewell placed them. The photos used to illustrate his findings were staged as well. In 2002, journalist Judith Hooper called the whole thing into question in her book Of Moths and Men, writing that the science was sloppy and biased. But researcher Michael Majerus spent 6 years between 2001 and 2007 redoing the study in a more natural setting. He found the same result though. Dart moths were eaten more often in clean environments. So the conclusion still stands, but the story's more complicated than the version that showed up in high school science books.
Project 4.1. Project 4.1 was a medical study conducted on the natives of Marshall Islands who in 1952 were exposed to radiation from the Castle Bravo nuclear test at Bikini Atoll, which inadvertently blew upwind to the nearby islands. Now, instead of informing the residents of the island of their exposure and treating the victims while they studied them, which would make the most sense and be the right thing to do, the good old US elected instead just to watch quietly and see what happened. And let me just say, this is extremely messed up. At first, the effects were inconclusive. For the first 10 years, miscarriages and stillbirths increased, but then returned to normal. Some people had developmental problems or stunted growth, but no conclusive pattern was detectable. After that first decade, though, a pattern did emerge, and it was ugly. There was an increase of thyroid cancer in young people, significantly above what would be considered normal. By 1974, almost a third of exposed islanders developed tumors. A report stated
that the dual purpose of what is now a Department of Energy medical program has led to a view by the Marshallese that they were being used as guinea pigs in a radiation experiment, which is just messed up. Number 9. Separating triplets. In the 1960s and 1970s, clinical psychologists led by Peter Neuberer ran a secret experiment in which they separated twins and triplets from each other and adopted them out as singlets. The experiment, said to have been partly funded by the National Institute of Mental Health, came to life when 3 identical triplet brothers accidentally found each other in 1980. They had no idea they had siblings. David Kelman, one of the triplets, felt anger towards the experiment. "We were robbed of 20 years together," he said. His brother Edward Galland died by ending his own life in 1995 at his home in Maplewood, New Jersey, according to the LA Times. The psychiatrists who were in charge, Peter and Viola Bernard, showed no remorse for their experiment, according to news reports. Viola went as far as to say they thought they were doing something good for them, separating them so they could develop their individual personalities. As for what Peter learned from his secret evil experiment, that's anyone's guess, as the results of the controversial study are being stored in an archive at Yale University, and they can't be unsealed until 2066. So hey, only 43 years until we find out the truth. Number 8. The Stanford Prison Experiment. In 1971, psychologist Philip Zimbardo, a professor at Stanford University, set out to test the nature of human nature, to answer questions such as what happens when you put good people in evil situations. To achieve this, he set up a prison and paid college students to play guards and prisoners, who inevitably seemed to transform into barbaric guards and hysterical prisoners. The 2-week experiment was shut down after just 6 days because things turned chaotic fast. In only a few days, our guards became sadistic and our prisoners became depressed and showed signs of extreme stress, Zimbardo stated. Those subjects assigned to guards enforced authoritarian measures and subjected the prisoners to psychological torture. Surprisingly, many of the prisoners accepted the treatment. The guards, pretty much from the get-go, treated the prisoners awfully, humiliating them by stripping them naked and spraying their bodies with chemicals and generally harassing and intimidating them. It's insane to me that they let this go on for 6 days. Number 7. Infected mosquitoes in towns. In 1956 and 1957, the United States Army conducted a number of biological warfare experiments on cities of Savannah, Georgia and Avon Park, Florida. It's crazy to me that they would experiment on their own people, especially without telling them, but I mean, it is America. In one experiment, millions of infected mosquitoes were released into the 2 cities in order to see if the insects could spread yellow fever and dengue fever. Not surprisingly, hundreds of researchers contracted illnesses that included fevers, respiratory problems, stillbirths, encephalitis, and typhoid. Now, in order to photograph the results of their experiments, Army researchers pretended to be public health workers, and several people died as a result of the research. Sounds like they just did this to themselves, but why would you do that to poor innocent people? Number 6. Mustard gas tested on American military. Mustard gas is a type of chemical warfare agent. As a chemical weapon, mustard gas was first used in World War I. In 1943, the US Navy exposed its own sailors to mustard gas. Officially, the Navy was testing the effectiveness of new clothing and gas masks against the deadly gas that had been proven so terrifying in the First World War. But the worst of the experiment occurred at the Naval Research Laboratory in Washington. Young men were approached after 8 weeks of boot camp and asked if they wanted to participate in an experiment that would help shorten the war. Obviously, they said yes, but they didn't know what they were signing up for. Only when the boys reached the research laboratory were they told the experiment involved mustard gas. In 2015, Roland Edwards, a soldier, spoke out about going through the experiment. He said, "It felt like you were on fire, guys started screaming and hollering and trying to break out, and then some of the guys fainted, and finally they opened the door and let us out, and the guys they were in bad shape." The participants, almost all of whom suffered severe external and internal burns, were ignored by the Navy, and in some cases threatened with the Espionage Act. In 1991, the reports were finally declassified and taken before Congress. Now listen, I'm not shocked that they were ignored afterwards, but that is just horrible. Number 5. Radioactive materials in pregnant women. So shortly after World War II, with the impending Cold War on the minds of Americans, many medical researchers were preoccupied with the idea of radioactivity and chemical warfare. This is a valid concern, so they did an experiment at Vanderbilt University. 829 pregnant women were given vitamin drinks they were told would help improve the health of their unborn babies. Instead, the drinks contained radioactive iron, and the researchers were studying how quickly the radioisotope crossed into the placenta. This is just messed up. I can't imagine thinking you're taking something that will help your own health and your future baby, but instead it does the opposite thing. Some of the women gave birth, and at least 7 of those born later died from cancers and leukemia. In addition, the women themselves experienced rashes, bruises, anemia, loss of hair and teeth, and cancer. Now this is just plain evil to me and makes me so upset.
In 2003, researchers in Shanghai created the first successful human-animal hybrid, often referred to as Rabbit Man. This involved fusing human cells with rabbit eggs, resulting in embryos that were part human and part rabbit. Yikes! Now, this wasn't the first attempt at a hybrid like this. Scientists in the US had been trying to create animal-human combinations for years, but hadn't really gotten anywhere with it. The Shanghai team, though, managed to develop embryos with a strikingly high percentage of human DNA, making these hybrids more human than rabbit. The goal was to explore stem cell research and the potential for organ transplants, but after just a few days of development, the embryos were destroyed and their stem cells were harvested. This led to some debate about the morality of creating life only to end it for scientific purposes. Plus, mixing human DNA with animals just feels creepy to a lot of folks. Not quite as blatantly messed up as the two-headed dog thing, but the concept of a rabbit man kind of sends shivers down my spine. I don't think it's something I'd ever actually want to see in real life, you know? In 2007, researchers at Yale conducted an experiment that involved injecting human neural stem cells into 5 monkeys suffering from Parkinson's disease. They wanted to see if these human cells could help alleviate the symptoms of their condition, and amazingly, the results were actually pretty promising. After the treatment, the monkeys had improvements. They were able to walk, eat, and move a lot better, and their tremors decreased without any adverse side effects like tumors or toxicity. The human neural cells didn't just coexist with the monkeys' brain cells. They actually survived and migrated within the monkeys' brains, changing how their brains functioned. So the question was, how many human cells could be integrated into a monkey's brain before it just fundamentally altered the creature? If these monkeys began to exhibit behavior that seemed more human, what exactly would we have on our hands? It's a lot to think about. Now let's dive into the world of wholphins, which are hybrids born from a female bottlenose dolphin and a male false killer whale. The first wholphin was found in 1981 at Tokyo SeaWorld. Sadly, it only lived for about 200 days. These hybrids are pretty much only found in marine parks and aquariums, though, places that have a pretty terrible reputation for how they treat their animals. And aside from the ethical concerns of marine parks themselves, wholphins face a whole host of health issues. Like most hybrids, they tend to have higher mortality rates and deal with psychological and behavioral problems. Mixing genetic material from 2 different species can create a lot of complications. These creatures just aren't designed to thrive like their parent species are, and their quality of life often takes a hit because of it. And the wild wholphins can't really exist naturally. The geographical behavioral differences between false killer whales and bottlenose dolphins make it nearly impossible for them to mate outside of captivity. So when humans breed things like this, it's a serious disruption of the natural order. So this messed up thing was dubbed the River Kovashi alien. In 1996, whatever this thing was washed up on the banks of the River Kovashi in Russia, and nobody had any idea what they were looking at. With the Leningrad nuclear power plant nearby, though, some speculated that the creature might have been mutated by radioactive waste leaking into the river. Now, at first, many thought it could be a mutant chicken embryo, but it didn't have any wings. Experts from the Institute of Biophysics examined it, but they also couldn't determine what it actually was. In March of 1956, something pretty messed up happened in the New Mexico desert near Holloman Air Force Base. Air Force Sergeant Jonathan Lovett and Major William Cunningham were out looking for debris from a rocket test when they came across a scene that would haunt them forever. Cunningham apparently heard a scream and rushed to find Lovett. Instead of an expected snake bite, he saw Lovett being pulled into a hovering silver disc by what looked like a long serpentine arm. The disc hovered about 15 to 20 feet off the ground, and before Cunningham could process what the hell he was seeing, it just shot up into the sky, with Lovett still inside. Terrified, Cunningham ran back to his Jeep to call for help. Security teams arrived, and while they took Cunningham to the base hospital, search parties were set out to find Lovett. 3 days later, they discovered his body. About 10 miles from the site, it was nude and severely mutilated. The autopsy couldn't provide any clear answers about what had happened. Years later, two men, William Cooper and former Green Beret Captain William English, claimed that they'd seen official reports on the incident, even though the government has consistently denied any record of it.
Number 4. Human experimentation in North Korea. Now, North Korea is known for being a horrible place. The North Korean government does not permit freedom of thought, opinion, expression, or information. All media is strictly controlled. Accessing phones, computers, televisions, radios, or media content that is not sanctioned by the government is illegal and considered anti-socialist behavior to be severely punished. North Koreans who have fled from the country in spite of legal punishment have described witnessing disturbing cases of human experimentation. In one alleged experiment, 50 healthy women prisoners were given poisoned cabbage leaves, and all 50 women were dead within 20 minutes. Other described experiments that include the practice of surgery on prisoners without anesthesia, purposeful starvation, beating prisoners over the head before using the zombie-like victims for target practice, and chambers in which whole families are put to death with suffocation gas. It is said that each month, a black van known as the Crow collects 40 to 50 people from a camp and takes them to a known location for experiments. I can't imagine the anxiety of thinking, am I next? Number 3. German medical experiments. During World War II, Germans performed medical experiments on prisoners in death camps. These prisoners were subject to heinous crimes under the guise of military advancement, medical and pharmaceutical advancement, and racial and population advancement. They were subjected to experiments intended to benefit the military, including hypothermia studies where prisoners were immersed in ice water in an effort to ascertain how long a drowned pilot could survive in similar conditions. Some victims were only allowed seawater, a study of how long pilots could survive at sea, and these subjects, not surprisingly, died of dehydration. Victims were also exposed to high altitude and decompression chambers, often followed with brain dissection on the living, to study high altitude sickness and how pilots would be affected by atmospheric pressure changes. Treating war injuries and pharmaceutical testing also went on in these camps. Victims were inflicted with wounds that were intentionally infected. Infections and poisonings were also studied on human subjects. Tuberculosis was injected into prisoners in an effort to better understand how to immunize against the infection. Experiments with poison to determine how fast subjects would die were also on the agenda. The Germans also performed genetic and racially motivated sterilizations, artificial inseminations, and also conducted experiments on twins and people of short stature. Absolutely disgusting. Number 2. The Aversion Project. Gay people were not liked in South Africa, especially in the armed forces. So they decided to get rid of them, and it's shocking. Using army psychiatrists and military chaplains who were presumably privy to private, confidential confessions, the regime flushed out homosexuals in the armed forces. But it did not evict them from the military. The homosexual undesirables were sent to a military hospital near Pretoria, a place called Ward 22, which in itself sounds terrifying. There, between 1971 and 1989, Dr. Aubrey Levin took care of patients. Many victims were subjected to chemical castrations and electric shock treatment meant to cure them of their homosexual condition. Dr. Levin used electroconvulsive aversion therapy to reordinate his patients. Electrodes were strapped to a patient's upper arm with wires running to a dial calibrated from 1 to 10. Homosexual men were also shown pictures of naked men and encouraged to fantasize, at which point the patient was subjected to severe shocks. When Dr. Levin was warned that he would be known as taking advantage of human rights, he immigrated to Canada. All I gotta say is, someone get him out of our country. Also, gay people and anyone in the LGBT community are not sick, we do not need to be cured, we are human, and you cannot get rid of us. And coming in at number 1 is Unit 731. Unit 731 was a covert biological and chemical warfare research and development unit in the Imperial Japanese Army that undertook lethal human experimentation during the Second Sino-Japanese War and World War II. It was responsible for some of the most notorious war crimes carried out by the Japanese personnel. Some of the numerous atrocities committed by the commander Shiro Ishii and others under his command in Unit 731 include vivisection of living people, including pregnant women who were impregnated by the doctors. Prisoners had limbs amputated and reattached to other parts of their body. Some prisoners had parts of their body frozen and thawed to study the resulting untreated gangrene. Humans were also used as living test cases for grenades and flamethrowers. Prisoners were injected with strains of diseases disguised as vaccinations to study their effects. Now, having been granted immunity by the American occupation authorities at the end of the war, Ishii never spent any time in jail for his crimes and died at the age of 67 of throat cancer. Now, the death toll of these brutal experiments is unknown, but as many as 200,000 may have died, estimates historian Sheldon H. Harris, according to a 1995 New York Times report. Now, this is just horrible, 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 and an abuse of power. How anyone could do this to other people truly disgusts me.
What if one wrong move in a lab could wipe out an entire city? That's what happened with the infamous Demon Core. In 1945 and 1946, scientists at Los Alamos were working on a plutonium core just under 14 pounds in weight, meant to be part of a third atomic bomb. This piece of metal looked harmless enough, but in reality, it was so unstable that the tiniest mistake could set off a deadly chain reaction. Two physicists, Harry Daghlian and Louis Slotin, both died from separate accidents while handling the core. Daghlian accidentally dropped a brick of tungsten carbide onto the plutonium, triggering a burst of radiation. Slotin made an even riskier mistake. He was using a screwdriver to hold apart two halves of a beryllium shell around the core. The screwdriver slipped. For less than a second, the plutonium went critical, unleashing a blinding flash of blue light. Slotin slammed the shell closed, saving the lab, but he absorbed a lethal dose of radiation and died 9 days later. The Demon Core was eventually melted down, but those incidents left everyone terrified. Physicists realized that in trying to study the heart of the atom, they had nearly unleashed another nuclear disaster on US soil. Before the very first atomic bomb was tested in New Mexico in 1945, some scientists feared it could literally ignite the atmosphere. The concern came from a terrifying calculation. What if the energy released from the fission reaction was enough to set nitrogen in the air or hydrogen in the oceans on fire? If that happened, it would trigger a runaway chain reaction that would engulf the entire planet. Theoretical physicists like Edward Teller raised the alarm, pushing Oppenheimer and others to recheck the math. Hans Bethe, a Nobel Prize-winning physicist, eventually proved that the reaction would stop before consuming the atmosphere. But the possibility was real enough that some scientists drove to the test site unsure if they'd live to see the sun rise. At 5:29 a.m. on July 16, 1945, the Trinity bomb went off. A blinding fireball lit up the desert, and for a moment, those watching thought maybe they had ended the world. Thankfully, the Earth did survive, but the terror in those moments was unforgettable. In 2008, when CERN prepared to power up the Large Hadron Collider in Switzerland, a new wave of panic hit headlines worldwide. The collider was built to smash protons together at nearly the speed of light, recreating conditions just after the Big Bang. Some scientists, and a lot of conspiracy theorists, warned that this could accidentally create a black hole. If it didn't evaporate instantly, it could sink into the Earth's core and swallow the planet whole. Lawsuits were filed in the United States and Europe to stop the collider from starting up. CERN issued a safety report showing that tiny black holes, if created, would vanish in trillionths of a second, but even even inside CERN, a few physicists admitted that the possibility, however small, was unnerving. When the collider finally went live, people around the world watched to see if the Earth would survive, and I think we're still here, but for a brief moment, the largest physics experiment in history had the world terrified. In December 1942, in a squash court under the stands at the University of Chicago, Enrico Fermi and his team built the world's first nuclear reactor, known as Chicago Pile 1. They stacked layers of graphite bricks and uranium by hand, creating the conditions for the first controlled chain reaction. But here is the terrifying part. No one knew exactly how controlled it really would be. There was a real fear the reaction could run away, releasing deadly radiation into downtown Chicago. Fermi prepared controlled rods of cadmium to absorb neutrons, and as a backup, 3 graduate students stood on a platform above the pile holding buckets of cadmium salt solution. Their job was to dump the liquid into the reactor if things got out of hand. On December 2nd, 1942, the reactor went critical for the first time. Nothing exploded, and the world entered the nuclear age. But the fact that humanity's first reactor was built under a football stadium in a city of millions left many scientists uneasy long after the experiment succeeded.
In the 1950s, the US Army decided to test biological weapons by spraying bacteria over San Francisco. They literally released bacteria into the air to see how a city might react to a biological attack. The bacteria they used, Bacillus globigii. You know what? Anything you can't pronounce is just not good, right? You don't want it in your food. You certainly don't want it in the air. It's just like the things that you can pronounce are just typically better for you. It's like on food packages, where it just lists all these messed up names. Just don't eat that stuff. Anyway, it was supposed to be harmless in small doses, but they didn't tell the people of San Francisco, once again, that they were being experimented on. The Army wanted to see how easily a biological agent could spread, and the residents of San Francisco were basically used as test subjects. I mean, they were. While the bacteria wasn't supposed to be harmful, it ended up getting people sick, and some even died. The military kept the whole thing secret for years, and when it eventually did come out, the public was, of course, furious. The Army had put thousands of people's health at risk just to test the potential effects of a biological weapon. CONTOPRO, the FBI's covert surveillance program that ran from 1956 to 1971. This program was designed to keep an eye on civil rights groups and political organizations in the States. The FBI didn't just spy on these groups, they also tried to destroy them. From the inside, groups like the Black Panther Party and Martin Luther King Jr.'s Southern Christian Leadership Conference were targeted by this organization, along with the anti-Vietnam War activists. The FBI used every dirty trick in the book: wiretaps, forged letters, anonymous threats to sow distrust in the movements they were targeting. In one infamous incident, the FBI sent an anonymous letter to Martin Luther King Jr. in an attempt to blackmail him into taking his own life. Project Bluebird was one of the CIA's earlier attempts to figure out how to control minds and influence behavior. This program was the precursor to MKUltra, and it focused on using substances like LSD, hypnosis, and other psychological techniques to manipulate people. They wanted to create spies or assassins who could be controlled remotely without them even realizing it. Experimented on their own employees and even used soldiers and civilians as guinea pigs, all without telling them what was really going on. They tested things like sensory deprivation and sleep deprivation again to see how they could break someone's will and control their thoughts. It was, of course, a very shady program that relied heavily on the idea that people could be turned into mind-controlled agents. In the 60s and early 70s, the US Department of Defense had a plan to get rid of old, unwanted munitions. The operation was called CHASE, which stands for Cut Holes and Sink 'em. As you can probably guess, the strategy was to load up decommissioned ships with outdated weapons and then sink them in the ocean. Most of the munitions were conventional weapons, like ammo and artillery, but a small portion of the shipments involved some very dangerous stuff like chemical weapons. The disposal sites were in the Atlantic Ocean. off the coast of Florida and the Bahamas, and in the Pacific Ocean as well. One of the biggest concerns at the time was the environmental impact and the possibility that the chemical weapons could leach into the ocean and contaminate it. As you can imagine, dumping toxic substances into the ocean isn't the best long-term solution. In 1964, a ship called Village was sunk with 7,348 tons of munitions. About 5 minutes after it went under, there were huge explosions. The blasts were so powerful that seismic equipment around the world picked them up. Now, luckily, this hadn't been a chemical weapons dump, but it showed just how dangerous this really was. By the late 60s, public awareness and concerns over dumping chemical weapons into the ocean was starting to grow. This culminated in the media coverage of the Chase 10 operation in 1970, where thousands of tons of chemical weapons were disposed of off the coast. But thankfully, in 1972, the US passed the Marine Protection, Research and Sanctuaries Act, and a year later, the United Nations put out an international ban on dumping chemical weapons at sea. In the 40s and 50s, the US government tested atomic bombs in places like Nevada and the Pacific Ocean. They didn't just test the bombs though, they also exposed people to the radiation from the tests. Soldiers were told to march toward ground zero right after the bomb went off, as if they were part of some military exercise, but these soldiers were exposed to radiation that would lead to all kinds of health problems down the line. Then there were the civilians. Thousands of people living near test sites were also unknowingly exposed to radiation. And to top it off, the government didn't tell anyone how dangerous the tests were, so people had no idea they were being exposed to deadly radiation. It wasn't until decades later that the full scope of these tests came out, but by then, the damage was already done. Finally, we have the US government's human radiation experiments, which took place mostly during the Cold War era. These experiments involved deliberately exposing American citizens to radiation, again, without their knowledge or consent, in order to study the effects of radiation exposure. The most infamous examples involved injecting people with radioactive material or having them swallow radioactive pills, all in the name of science. Many of the people involved in these experiments had no idea they were being tested on. Some were even pregnant women or underage themselves. Obviously, these experiments caused some severe long-term health issues for the victims. The US government didn't come clean about it until decades later. Now, I guess what we've learned from this video is, if you're doing something really nefarious, just don't tell anyone about it, because who's going to agree to any of this? Oh yeah, I'll eat some radioactive pills. Whew, Cold War, not a fun time to live through.
Not all physics experiments end with success. In 1999, at a uranium processing facility in Tokaimura, Japan, workers were mixing a batch of fuel for a reactor. Instead of carefully following protocol, they poured too much uranium solution into the tank. This mistake caused the mixture to go critical. A bright blue glow filled the room as gamma radiation blasted out. The workers nearby were hit with massive doses of radiation. 2 of them suffered agonizing injuries and died after months in the hospital. And what terrified scientists was how quickly things spiraled out of control. The chain reaction kept restarting for nearly 20 hours, forcing emergency crews to improvise ways to stop it. For many physicists, this was a very sobering reminder. One simple mistake in handling fissile material could trigger a disaster worse than any lab is prepared for. At the bottom of Siberia's Lake Baikal, scientists set up an experiment in the 1980s to study neutrinos, tiny particles that pass through everything, including the Earth itself. To do this, they lowered an array of sensors deep under the frozen lake, but once the experiment went online, something terrifying happened. The detectors started picking up signals they couldn't explain. Bright flashes of light lit up the water, sometimes in patterns too regular to be random. Some scientists speculated about new physics. Others whispered about UFOs, since locals around the region had long reported strange lights in the lake. For years, the unexplained events haunted the researchers, years, leaving them unsure if they were looking at particle interactions or something far stranger. While the Baikal telescope continues to operate today, those early mysterious flashes remain one of the most unsettling moments in neutrino physics. In July 1962, during the height of the Cold War, the US military decided to see what would happen if you set off a hydrogen bomb in space. They called it Project Starfish Prime. At 250 miles above the Pacific, the bomb exploded with a yield of 1.4 megatons. The explosion lit up the night sky like daylight, but what terrified scientists was the aftermath. The blast created an artificial radiation belt around the Earth. Satellites started failing one by one as radiation fried their electronics. Even months later, the artificial belt was still there, circling the planet like a man-made hazard. For physicists, this was a nightmare. They realized they had permanently altered near-Earth space with one single test, and no one knew if it would last decades or even longer. The fear of accidentally destroying satellites or even the ozone layer made future space tests extremely controversial. On September 22, 1979, an American Vela satellite detected a strange double flash over the Indian Ocean. These flashes were the unmistakable signature of a nuclear explosion. But here's the problem. No country admitted to conducting a test. Some scientists believed it was South Africa and Israel secretly detonating a nuclear device. Others thought it might have been a meteoroid hitting the satellite or even a glitch in the sensors. The uncertainty terrified the scientific community because if it was a real test, it meant the nuclear club had just expanded in secret. But if it wasn't, then a reliable satellite system had failed at the worst possible time. Decades later, the Vela incident is still debated, and the fact that no one could explain it left physicists deeply unsettled. In the 1980s, the United States began building what was supposed to be the largest particle accelerator ever, the superconducting super collider in Texas. It was designed to be more powerful than CERN's Large Hadron Collider, but as construction began, concerns started to spread. Some feared it could create exotic particles that might destabilize matter itself. Others worried it could trigger events nobody had ever seen before. Rumors swirled in the media that the machine could destroy the planet. Ultimately, the project was canceled in 1993 due to cost overruns and politics. But for scientists, it left a chilling thought. Had it been built, we might have been running experiments that went far beyond anything we've dared to attempt since. Not all terrifying physics experiments involve nuclear bombs. Sometimes they involve the question of whether we're alone. In 1977, while scanning the skies with the Big Ear radio telescope, astronomer Jerry Emmon recorded a 72-second signal unlike anything ever detected. It was strong, structured, and came from the direction of the Sagittarius constellation. On the printout, Emmon circled the signal and wrote "Wow" in the margin. For weeks afterward, scientists tried to detect it again, but the signal never reappeared. The possibility that it came from an advanced extraterrestrial civilization was both thrilling and terrifying. If aliens were signaling us, it meant humanity had just brushed against something far beyond our understanding. And if it wasn't aliens, then the fact that no one could explain it left astronomers and physicists equally as uneasy.